Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today in day 3 of the WSA Exhibition Festival. Just to start with housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on YouTube later. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Magda Mostafa. Magda is a global autism design consultant at Progressive Architects and author of the Autism Aspects Design Index, the world's first research-based framework. Global autism design consultant at Progressive Architects and author of the Autism Aspects Design Index, the world talking about it today. Thank you for joining, Magda. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Minna. I was really very happy to receive your invitation, and I'm glad that you're hosting me today. So do you want me to share my screen? Can I?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, so when I received this invitation from Minna and Kirsty to talk about this day 3 of your event around morphology and shape making and how we think about our future design, I was very excited because one of the things I tried to do in my work, as Minna kindly introduced, my area of specialization is around autism design. And it seems like currently, or some may see it as a very niche and specialized area, but I'm finding recently in our work that the benefits of thinking from the autistic perspective are actually spilling over into a lot of other areas, and there's a lot of intersections of benefits for others in the larger practice of form making and form giving and thinking about the morphology of our spaces. So my talk today is called Spectrum Space, and this is a concept that I've been exploring and investigating over the past few years, and terminology I've been developing around thinking about not only our users as a spectrum. Those of you who are familiar with autism know that we refer to it as a spectrum because it's so wide and vast and diverse, but also thinking about our architectural spaces through that same lens of a spectrum and that diversity, and really thinking about our architecture as a whole palette of spaces and a whole landscape of opportunities, rather than thinking of them as parceled pieces of space, that this is for typical users, this is for autistic users, this is for mobility users, but to think in a more spectrum perspective around space in general. And this is going to be explained through the lens of neurodiversity and autism-centered design. So I want to begin with this diagram. I know as students, I'm very excited to be talking to students because I think that our hope to make change to the current situation we are in around inclusion or lack thereof will be solved with this generation of students who are very socially conscious and aware of the diversity of the reality of our world, that I am confident once this cohort of socially aware students graduates into the world, there will be a lot of change on many, many fronts. And one of them, I think, is in the disability access, diversity, and inclusion space. But academically, we talk a lot about user-centered design and human-centered design, and beginning with the profile of the user and understanding users' needs. And that in and of itself is a wonderful approach, and it's very noble. But one of the problems with that approach is that who we define as the user, as the human at that center of that process, is very different depending on who you talk to. It's very different contextually. It's very different geographically, it's very different typologically, and it shouldn't. We should all be thinking of everyone when we think of that center, that person at the center. But right now, both the way we educate our students, the way we legislate our codes and practices and regulations, and the way we practice as architects limits the profile of that magical imaginary user to a very limited specific profile that does not include the majority of us, actually. And this began to be formalized and operationalized in the early 20th century with the Bauhausian movement and standardization of design practice beyond the more romanticized version of the earlier century. And all of you are familiar with the Le Corbusier modular, which in and of itself is a milestone in how we think about space, and standardization and mass production of architecture resolved a lot of issues, but at the same time created this normative lens that we have continued since that point to think about design, because that imaginary individual in Le Corbusier's mind and the standards as a consequence that came out of modernist international school thinking was based on the male, normative, 6 foot tall, able-bodied, seeing, hearing, speaking, Western model of individual. And based on that, we designed everything. And we know, even just looking around the panel of speakers or the panelists on that call, not all of us fall into that categorization. Just even this little snapshot of speakers today do not all conform to that model that a whole century of work was based on. And our reality of the human form, as illustrated beautifully here by this illustration by Thomas Carpenter, is very, very diverse and much more expansive and different than that single user. And when you add to that conversation the narrative of intersectionality, again, through this beautiful artwork by Mona Chalabi, that really every user and every person at that middle of that first circle is more than one thing. We are more than one identity. And the way we've designed for hundreds of years has been around that single identity. In reality, and what this graphic does very beautifully is it distills down statistically the population of New York City, that if New York City were 100 people, 68 would be people of color, 37 would be immigrants, 19 would live in poverty, 11 would have a disability, and 14 would be over the age of 65 and categorized as seniors. And when you add all those numbers up, they don't add up to 100, which means that there are going to be individuals that fall within 2 or more of those categories that intersect across these identities. And the problem with that is that every single one of those identities is excluded from that normative model. We don't necessarily design for persons of color. We don't design for the language barriers of immigrants. We don't design for poverty in mind when we're thinking about our standardized design model and the designs that came out of it. And then the intersectionalities of those identities complicate the problem even further. So what I have dedicated now about 20 years of my life is to resolve and to think about how we can resolve that specifically for autism and neurodiversity, but also how we can change the narrative around this conversation and this problem broadly. So I'll begin with some terminology, and my students know how concerned I am with words, because I really believe words matter, and how we talk about things and how we identify things can have huge impact on the limitations of those solutions. So over the past few years, we've been looking at language like inclusion and accessibility, and it's become more common in what we teach our students that we want to create inclusive spaces. We want to make sure that they're accessible to everyone. And that is leaps beyond where we used to be. However, it still is limiting, because the word inclusion assumes a norm. It still has that normative element to it. It assumes that there is an us and a them, and that there is an othering of individuals that we need to take efforts to include into our spaces and forms. And that in and of itself is problematic. Other terminology has recently emerged in this space, and the word that I am gravitating a lot towards is the term availability. And it was specifically brought to my attention during the Chicago Architecture Biennale, where I presented some of my work in its last cycle that was curated by the wonderful David Brown. And the theme of that Biennale was the available city. And I found that very appealing, because it seemed as a word to be much more democratizing. It presented the city or our landscapes or our environments as this ecosystem that is just available for everyone. That's a series of affordances that people can engage with in a way that can be customized to their abilities, their needs, and their desires and aspirations. And that to me was a very appealing just mindset in how we think about our spaces. And it goes back to that term of spectrum space, that if we think of our spaces as this big spectrum of this seamless array of opportunities that is available for everyone, and that becomes our position of how we define what architecture is, then maybe we'll be one step closer to creating this world that I dream of, where everyone is equal and everyone is included and everyone has services and everything equally available to them like everyone else. And at the center of all of that thinking is autism-centered design. And I'll talk to you a little bit about where I am in my space about thinking around this field that is, as I said, small just by nature of the population that I work with. However, we're learning every day that the benefits of thinking through the lens of autism can not only be very beneficial for larger populations, but it is a very moving, impactful, and powerful lens to look through. And I'm going to end my talk with a few examples of the lenses that autistic individuals themselves have given me the pleasure to share with them on how they think about space and their place within it. So just a quick little bit of an academic tour through the theory and disability theory and how it's evolved over the years. So where we are in thinking about disability, whether as architects, as sociologists, as the medical community, as the education community, has gone through several phases. And up until about a century ago, we only defined disability through the lens of the medical model. And that assumed a certain hierarchy of power of those that are able and healthy and those that are not. And it was all about pathologizing the disability, that it was, even today, I was just having a conversation with a group that I was unhappy with their terminology of using the word cure and disease and illness around autism. And I refuse to engage in that conversation because we've moved past that medical model now. And when we were in the medical model, it was always about that there's the person that has a problem, the person that has a pathology, and they need to be cured in order to be brought into the normative state. And that is one that's based very much on sympathy and that had that power hierarchy structure of othering that I always try and challenge. We moved from that in post-World War II and around post-World War I, I apologize, and around World War II, especially with a lot of injuries and mobility challenges that happened en masse across the world, towards the functional model that looked at a person's abilities and trying to rehabilitate them to be more able. So we had the emergence of prosthetics and physical therapy and rehabilitation that has, of course, had tremendous impact in the world of disabilities, but it still assumed a certain norm that people needed to come into. So for example, in the deaf community, people were taught to read lips and to vocalize so that they could learn the skills that would make them quote unquote normal. And that was still problematic because it still had that power structure and that sympathy model of us and them. During the 1960s and the social consciousness movements and the civil rights movements that we saw across the whole globe, beginning with the establishment post-World War I of the United Nations Rights Convention of Human Rights and the movements that happened as a consequence, we moved into the stage that we call the social model, where it was seen that society was the problem, the environment wasn't designed with individuals' needs, and we needed to change the environment. And that's where you start seeing legislation about codes and International Building Code and the Americans for Disabilities Act, and legislation that's starting to be passed that requires our cities and spaces and buildings and schools and hospitals to be broadly accessible to people with disabilities, and that we needed to change our society and our education systems to be more inclusive. But that still fell within this empathy model and still had an element of normalizing and bringing people in. The place where we're at right now, and really the group that has spearheaded this effort, is the deaf community. They're very much far ahead. They see deaf as a culture. They see deafness not as hearing loss, but as deaf gain, as coming into this cultural world that is just a different language. And the cultural model from the perspective of autism is that autism is an equally valid, but just a different way of perceiving the world. And I'm not trying to minimize the challenges that come with it, because those challenges can be profound, they can be crippling, they can be lifelong. However, if we begin to see disability as a culture that is valid and equal, but just different, but not separate, then we move more into this space of empathy and cultural modeling. The final space that I've actually pushed beyond this timeline specifically in my work is what I call disability as expertise, and specifically autism as expertise. And it's built on Damien Milton's philosophy of double empathy. It's about that empathy shouldn't be hierarchical, but it should be democratic and equal, and that there should be empathy on both sides. So not only should the autistic individual learn to cope or learn skills to be part of the non-autistic population, the non-autistic population also needs to learn the language and be empathetic to the perceptual model of autism and be able to engage in that way. So it's reciprocal and it is more democratizing. And there really is expertise to be learned when you think of autism from that perspective. And I'll talk about it a little bit more and give you some examples. So all of this theoretical, hypothetical thinking converged into the development of the Autism Aspects Design Index, which we developed and published and trademarked in 2014 and registered. And it is a framework. I don't think of it as a code necessarily, that it's not prescriptive, but it's rather a framework or a paradigm in how we can and should think about architectural space and urban space and city space through the lens of autism, through these 7 constructs. And I'll go through them one at a time in a moment. But right now, Minna was actually kindly sharing with me her own engagement with some of my work, which I'm very proud and honored to hear about. But Aspects is being used in many different ways around the world. Students are engaging in it. Colleagues are teaching it in their studios. Architects are embracing it in their practices. We have consulted and built and disseminated. And I'm very excited that there are so many spaces that are now thinking through the Aspects lens about their spaces and places. We've had multiple. I need to add the Welsh School of Architecture and Wales University here. But these are the different partners that we've collaborated with and different platforms that we've engaged in. So back to the aspects and what the 7 principles are. They begin, the first one is acoustics, and it is probably the most impactful element that we need to think about when we're thinking about neurodiversity and autism. And I remember a mother very early on when I was doing scoping surveying of the autism community, responding to a very academic long survey that I sent her that was aimed at gauging what the architectural and built environment elements were that were triggers to her son's life and his behavior. And she ignored all of my questions and came back to me with 3 words. She said, acoustics, acoustics, acoustics. And in her mind, that was the most crucial thing that we needed to engage with. And this was 20 years ago, and I've never forgotten that very dramatic response. That the acoustical environment really in our world today, we have bombarded ourselves with so much noise and busyness and alerts and badges and buzzes and music, and that just our cities and existing within them, there's this background buzz that when you are on the autism spectrum, or if you have sensitivities, can be extremely distracting and disabling. So one of the first things we really encourage anyone adopting Aspects to think about is the acoustical environment. The next principle is spatial sequencing. And spatial sequencing is interesting because it was born out of that autism expertise itself. So one of the issues or the characteristics of the autistic life or the autistic perspective is this adherence and comfort to routine and predictability. And you'll find that some individuals on the spectrum will create these routines to their lives that allow them to move through them more seamlessly in a way that is predictable and easier to manage. And in the past, when we were still in that medical model, that was seen as a problem. That was seen actually as a symptom of the disorder, and was seen as a problem that needed to be quote unquote cured. And this is a really good example of why that medical model is so dangerous and so destructive, because something like that adherence to routine and predictability, a lot of effort was made to change that and to quote unquote extinguish it from the autistic behavior. And the problem with that is that there wasn't an effort to look at the rationale and the reason behind that predictability and routine. And actually, it's quite a brilliant coping mechanism that individuals on the spectrum have created for themselves in order to eliminate surprises and unexpected stimulation into their life that will make carrying out daily activities more challenging. So when they create and build their everyday lives, like their life at school or on campus, around routine and predictability, they can free up mental, perceptual, cognitive space for the learning that is required of them on campus. So what we did in developing this concept of spatial sequencing, rather than saying, oh, routine and predictability is a symptom of autism, you need to learn to be more flexible and you need to be more adaptable, and you can't be so fixated with your routine and obsessive, and use that very negative medicalized language around the characteristic of their life, to embrace it and to say, you know what, this routine is great. It frees up so much space for you to do other things. Let's actually design the spaces that you are going to engage in around that routine. And all of us embrace the benefits of having predictability in our spaces, in our schools, in our systems, and our campuses, and our workplaces, and our hospitals, and our cities. So everyone is not bombarded with all this stimulation that's unnecessary to the task, that's unpredictable, that's unexpected, that takes up brain space and bandwidth, and that will allow all of us to be more comfortable in our spaces. So what we do when we're designing with spatial sequencing in mind is we almost storyboard, like someone would in writing a theater, a play for the theater or a movie for the screen. You almost block out the scenario and choreograph the activities of the daily life, and then build the architecture around that story. So it's creating narrative-based architectural spaces so that you move through spaces in the same sequence as much as possible that you are intending to experience them. And we do a lot of that designing in section because it goes through the flow of spaces. And this tactic overlaps with a tactic that I'll talk about in a moment, which is sensory zoning, that makes sure not only are we sequencing our spaces through the timeline of the daily routine of how they will be engaged in, but also through the levels of sensory engagement. So we go from high stimulation to low stimulation, and we do that gradually rather than abruptly. And I'll talk about that specifically in a moment. The third concept of aspects is escape. And I think this is one of the easiest and clearest concepts of the 7. And it's about creating this network of little refugee pockets of spaces. And again, this is something that was born out of autism expertise. Almost every autistic individual I've engaged with in schools, in homes, at universities and workplaces have created for themselves their own escapescape. And I call it this escapescape. It's a landscape of escape spaces where they can retreat to when sensory overload happens, or when they need to transition from one experience to another. And escape isn't about isolation. So it isn't about locking yourself away, but it's about creating a space that mitigates the need to ultimately lock yourself away, because people on the spectrum and all of us may find moments where we want to lock ourselves away from the overwhelming environment. By creating this escapescape, you hopefully never get to that point. You have moments of less isolated retreat that you can go to when you need it. Compartmentalization, like escape, but it's a softer form of escape, organizes our spaces. And I have 2 examples here, one on the interior of a classroom, one on the exterior at the level of an urbanscape or a streetscape network. It's about organizing our complex environments into these manageable zones and pieces that will only have the sensory cues, the furniture arrangements, the textures and materials that we need for that task. So for example, in this classroom layout, if you're working on a computer one-on-one focus task, you don't need to see the games and the puzzles and the bouncy ball and the monitor playing a movie in the background. You need to only focus on the compartment of that skill that you're working on. So we create these little stations and compartments in classes so that we create that environment for individuals. And it can scale up like you see in the example on the city. The next concept is about transitioning, and this works with that diagram of spatial sequencing. So as you're moving from one zone to the next, what we recommend for the autistic experience is to build into our spaces an infrastructure of transition zones which are like escape spaces, a space for retreat, but they are intentionally located between high stimulation zones and low stimulation zones. And a good example is the one you see here that is at Dublin City University in the project that we helped them design in one of their student common spaces. So as students are coming in from the central mall of the campus that is very busy and vibrant and crowded, as they move into the social space, there are these little floating nodes embedded into the wall that they can retreat to and sit in and reorient themselves before they have to move into the next task. And you have enough of those throughout your spaces, you can help facilitate that adjustment as you move through your experience. Sensory zoning, like I said earlier, is about, as architects and as architecture students, we're taught to zone according to function, but sensory zoning asks you to zone according to the senses, which is the perspective through which autistic individuals experience their spaces. And finally, of course, safety, relationship to choice of materials and control zones and observation is really important. I mentioned very quickly the Autism Friendly University campus project that we did at Dublin City, which is was an amazing experience for me. But one of the great takeaways and lessons learned from that is that we took a second reflective look at our work in aspects. And as a scholar and a designer, I'm always reflecting back on what I've done before. I am always trying to improve and add on. So one of the results of that was that we published Aspects 2.0, which is an expansion of the original 7 concepts that I just outlined to include elements like color schemes, elements like lighting, materials, furniture, concepts for wayfinding and navigation, and I'll give you an example of one of those strategies in a moment, but also how we can incorporate technology and smart buildings, and then more dynamic elements like the sensory economics of space and programming and operation, and maybe we can talk about a little bit more in the Q&A. But one of the concepts that I am currently engaging in and I'm trying to tackle is this idea of the sensory as commodity. And it's interesting because we almost have become blind to the amount of sensory stimulation that is in our everyday lives. And the slide to the right of the Tokyo Streetscape by Lauren Julif is an exaggeration perhaps of that, but it's an exaggeration to make a point that our cityscapes, our airports and train stations, even our campus environments, our retail spaces, our residential spaces have just become completely commodified for stimulation, for advertising, for music, for light, for sound, and oftentimes only with a commercial purpose, not necessarily a health and well-being purpose for the users of those spaces. And it's gotten to the point that as someone who designs from the autistic perspective, I feel a responsibility to call out, because environments like these are disabling for people on the autism spectrum, to the extent that when these spaces are designed in these ways, individuals on the spectrum may not be able to engage as equally and as freely as someone who doesn't have the sensory profile that someone on the spectrum would. And the other slide is a beautiful graphic piece of artwork by the brilliant Stuart Nielsen, who I'll show you several pieces of work, who himself is autistic and is an artist. He's Irish. He's an autistic artist and researcher, and he created this overlay at University College Cork of his experience of one of the office transparent spaces, and all of that information in a series of snapshots of moments of reflections on the glass and the transparency and people moving by the corridor, all overlaid together, demonstrated just that one line of sight and how sensory overwhelming that is. And the point that I'm making with that slide is that that sensory commodification is actually as disabling to someone on the spectrum as a flight of stairs is to someone on a wheelchair. And we need to be more mindful of that. So I'll talk about how that relates to aspects and the tools that we have and spatial well-being, and some examples that we have designed using aspects around different projects and different typologies and how they can be operationalized. So the first is a medical. I thought I'd start with a healthcare space. I was the autism design consultant with Alta Studios, and we helped design the University of Nebraska's medical center, the Monroe Meyer Institute, that engages and provides healthcare, general healthcare, for people with developmental disabilities. And there is a section there dedicated to autism and early childhood intervention, but also provides just general healthcare like dentistry and orthopedics and so on and so forth to the autistic community. So it was a really interesting healthcare space to design, and they brought me on board and engaged with the aspects, principles, and one of the things that we did, this is one example of how we plugged in by looking at the sensory zoning of the hospital, where the red high stimulation and the yellow low stimulation zones were in collision with one another. We plugged in these transition spaces along the wayfinding strategy of these little plug-in spaces that people could go to. Another healthcare space project that I was honored to be part of was in partnership with Abe Rogers Design, who's a UK-based architect who recently won the Wolfson Economics Prize for planning and designing the hospital of the future. And I had the privilege and honor to be a small part of his brilliant team that came together to develop a scheme for what they called the living hospital. And it was all about engaging and bringing in nature. And I had the opportunity to reflect, and I can share this essay with all of you, but to reflect on the perspective of autism and neurodiversity and how it relates to accessibility of a hospital in general. And part of my role here was to red flag the issue that because of the way we're designing hospitals today and our lack of understanding of how disabling the sensory environment of the built hospital world can be for autism and neurodiversity, there are people on the autism spectrum who are less healthy, who are suffering from more complex and severe forms of illnesses that are preventable. One of the reasons is the built environment of the hospital is inaccessible to them. It is so painful for them to be in the hospital environment. It's so anxiety inducing for them to be there that they are delaying healthcare and not getting the healthcare that they need and want, to the extent that mortality rates, not only because of the built environment for other reasons, but mortality rates in autism for no clinical reason are much higher than many other populations, and presentations of simple diseases like appendicitis and also life-threatening diseases like cancer and heart disease are much more complex and complicated as a result of delayed care. And one of the reasons of that is the way we're designing our hospitals, and that is something that is life-threatening that we need to change. The Autism Friendly University project was an amazing experience. I showed you the autism friendly communal space that we designed. It's all about creating autism friendly spaces and showcasing them to the general student population, not just for the autistic student population, but for everyone, to flip that narrative around the stigma. This is what I call reverse inclusion. It's about putting the autistic need first and then including the general population into that autistic design space. And in doing so, it's kind of a living awareness campaign. Look how beautiful and comfortable a space can be and how rewarding it can be when it's designed with the autistic perspective in mind. We also designed autism-friendly residence rooms as part of this whole new student residence that was being built. And it was about putting compartmentalization and the lighting strategies and all the strategies we came up with in a very confined space. And it became like this refuge space for students. We also created an entire escapescape, and I'll talk about this maybe later in a few minutes from the autistic perspective, but it was about planning campus in a way that had this whole escape network that were plugged in of spaces and pods and places that people could go to as they were navigating throughout campus. This is one of the examples of the escape spaces within one of the buildings. Some other projects that I have had the opportunity and privilege to apply aspects to are other vulnerable communities. This is an orphanage that I helped design in Ramallah, Palestine, for what we call triple vulnerable population. So these were refugee orphan children on the spectrum. So they had an intersectionality that was just so challenging. And this group was so generous in allowing me to apply the aspects index to the design that they had created for this small group of students. Another project that scales this up to the level almost of the urban scale in the city was in collaboration with Dar al Amran, Ras al Badran, and Ma'mar in the Emirates for the Sharjah City for Humanitarian Services. And it was all about thinking about not only creating an autism school within a larger campus, but it was an entire neighborhood that was going to be designed with this autism first, disability first perspective, even in the non-specialized spaces like shops and coffee places and restaurants and shopping malls and museums and retail spaces and workplaces. So it was a very aspirational project that I had the pleasure of being engaged in, that we took some of the wayfinding strategies that we have developed on the small scale all the way up to the level of the city. I've also recently been thinking about how aspects can be used as a tool to assess the performance of existing buildings. So a lot of times people will come to me with an existing building, whether it's a campus or a workplace or a healthcare space or a residence. We don't always have the opportunity to build from scratch. And a lot of our work, just from the sustainability perspective, is about reworking what we already have constructed and existing. So out of the Dublin City Autism Friendly University Guide we created an autism friendly design audit, which is a multiple page, this is just a snapshot of it, but it's a multiple page criteria checklist that you can score the performance of a building against. We also looked at how aspects aligns not only with where other researchers are working in the field, like McAllister and Lee and Shireen Kanakri in the US, but also standards like the Well Building Standard that is not necessarily looking specifically at autism, neurodiversity, or disability access, but is looking at levels of comfort. And there's a lot of research that's being done around how when we invest in creating more comfortable, healthy buildings, we actually get higher productivity, better learning, healthier buildings, and healthier populations. And when you look at those well-building standards that are creating positive impacts in our world and see how they track and map against aspects and aspects 2.0, particularly aspects 2.0, you see that there's a very strong alignment. So you can make the argument that by investing in aspects and aspects 2.0 strategies, you will also have the same benefits of building in accordance to things like the well-building standard. And we used these different building assessment tools to look at a lot of other projects around the world. This was the Western Autistic School that was designed by Paul Heed and his firm that did a wonderful work. They had a lot of compartmentalization, bringing nature, sensory zoning, a lot of the things that aspects called for in the context of this Australian school. My friend Simon Humphreys also, we assessed his school, the Center for Autism in Abu Dhabi, and there's a lot of those wayfinding navigation materiality issues. And the result of that, it's a paper that's published, I'm happy to share with anyone, but the result of that is that we saw a lot of alignment between how the users of buildings were scoring the autism friendliness, quote unquote, of their building and aspects compliance, which gave us an indication that aspects was actually a good predictor of autism friendliness and could be a good tool to develop that. And then in the same vein, we've been doing post-occupancy evaluations. I had the wonderful experience to collaborate with the Els for Autism Foundation in Jupiter, Florida, and perform post-occupancy evaluation in their wonderful center and school there, and then propose some retrofits and reorganization of spaces. We've recently gone back and taken a look and done some surveys. One of the more popular strategies that we put in the school was what we call the purple pods. And these are transition zones that are plugged in throughout the school. And they have been so successful in that they have gone beyond their purpose and use as transitions. They are even being used by students. Those of you who are familiar with autism education, its curriculum, know that it's based on reinforcement. So students are actually asking for time in the purple pods as reward and reinforcement for learning. And it's become a really effective way. You can see here, this is actually the executive director of the foundation. It's being used by students and staff. It's being used by parents. It's being used by students for socialization and in initiating social interactions, which is wonderful. And we're in the process we're about to publish the results of that survey. Looking beyond just the autistic lens, I think it's also to think about, so what does it mean for the general population? Because a lot of times my work can be critiqued in that, okay, so that's fine if you're designing a school for autism or a home for autism or an autism inclusion strategy, but what about all other general purpose buildings? So I recently joined a design think tank and design consultancy in New York, headed up by the brilliant Joel Sanders and my colleagues Hansel Baumann, who is the author of Deaf Space, and Aaron Friedlander, who is a medical professional, and Seb Cha, who is works on gender and different accessibility spaces with Joel, to establish mixed design. And through mixed design, we have recently developed and published something that we call multisensory wayfinding. And the reason we engaged with wayfinding is that wayfinding, navigation, and corridor and hallway space is one of those typologies that is in every building. And what we tried to do in this exercise is look at something as simple as a hallway and a circulation space through the lenses of deafness, blindness, wheelchair use, autism, aging, gender, and think about how we can create a single space that serves all of these needs without separating, and do it in one single space, and where the intersections are. So for example, these spaces on the far left create these little pockets where individuals who are deaf and use sign language can speak to one another because they need to be facing and they can step out, but it also serves as an escape space for ASD users. And then these acoustical cones in the center of the slide also create these little islands of silence for people who are on the spectrum who need that little escape and quiet retreat. But it also is really great for someone, for example, who is blind and navigating with the acoustics to recalibrate themselves and find a moment of silence in that acoustical world. One of another spaces that I'm working on and in at the moment is the design thinking space. And I don't know how many of you as students have engaged in the design thinking process. It's a really incredible set of tools of how we can tackle problems. The problem, however, with the design thinking process in and of itself is it's very visual. It is very, in times, unstructured and open-ended. And it's also social, and it's based on social interaction and conversation and verbal conversation. And those three things alone are very challenging for the autistic community. So in doing these design thinking workshops, I had the opportunity to do two of them, one with an autism self-advocacy group called As I Am in Ireland, one with Dublin City University post-pandemic, which happened remotely, and one in between with Google Zurich, where we engaged with a group of people in that tech space. So interestingly, we developed as a result a rethink of the design thinking process from the autistic perspective, kind of like an edit to a version of design thinking, and came up with these strategies of how we can conduct these normally very chaotic workshops in a way that could be more respectful and inclusive to the autistic experience, that is actually more, at least for my experience, a much easier way to engage with the material and the process of design thinking. So things like planning and predictability, to make things more visual rather than verbal, not to make it so much about social interaction and maybe allow for remote access and so on and so forth. And I'm going to close because I'm almost at time, in just the last few minutes, with something that I think is absolutely central and essential to all of my work, which is the autistic perspective and autism as expertise. And everything that I've presented to you today, I can track its roots back to an autistic voice, an autistic idea, an autistic invention. The autistic mind and the way that it perceives the world, engages with the world, and then adapts to that world is so rich with lessons to be learned that if we just began there, we would learn so much, not only how to design for autism, but how to design better for everyone. And I'll show you a few examples, but just to double down on that, I am always shocked at how many clients come to me and say, oh, you're an expert on designing for autism. How would we go about doing this for our autistic students or our autistic patients or our autistic whoever, library users? And my first response is, have you asked them? And they're always confused, but you're the expert. I said, well, as an expert, I'm only an expert because I asked them first, because I began with the autistic voice. I began with the autistic experience, and that is what, and I was only an informed observer. I came in with architectural tools and I took that knowledge and turned it into architectural tools, but I can't claim that knowledge as my own entirely. And that's why I think it's so important to begin with the autistic voice. So these photographs are actually a recreation that my wonderful friend Melek Yassin, who is a brilliant photographer, helped recreate for me. They were inspired by one of the very first young boys I ever engaged with in the autism space, and an experience that his mother shared with me around when he was a young boy and struggling for his space in school, and teachers were struggling with her, trying to get him to be engaged in different activities. Someone suggested maybe he would like to take a photography class or a photography club or something. And he was given his first assignment by the photography teacher, which was a list of things to go out and take pictures of: a tree, a house, a boy, a puppy. And he came back with photographs that looked very much like this. And the photography teacher was furious, called the mother in, said he's failed the exercise. None of these subjects are in the frame. He didn't understand the assignment, and this isn't going to work. And so the mother asked to see the pictures, and she said, well, actually, he did take a picture of a puppy, but it's the shadow of a puppy. He did take a picture of a boy, but it's the reflection of the boy. He did take a picture of the house, but it's the silhouette of the house. So what she discovered from this exercise that her son did was the reason why he wasn't making eye contact with his teacher wasn't that he wasn't interested in what she was saying, but because her visual stimulation was so much for him and eye contact was so difficult for him, that what he was doing was following her shadow or following her reflection in the window. And that helped him know where she was pointing, how she was gesturing, where she was moving. And he added that and integrated it with what he was hearing, and then he was able to learn from her. So this was a strategy that he came up with. And I just think it's such a brilliant way of getting a glimpse into the world of the autistic perspective. The other piece that actually came from the Dublin City University Autism Friendly University project was this concept of what we call the sensory pathway. And I've actually named it after the brilliant young woman who came up with this idea. We call it the Milena pathway. I've named it after Milena because on some of the one-on-one sensory audits that her and I did, she is an autistic student at DCU. She shared with me that how she navigates the very dense, busy campus was through the back alleyways and behind the buildings and through the interstitial space between the buildings, as opposed to the central circulation space. And she did that because she wanted to avoid the crowds and the noise of the central space. So we decided to fully embrace that and create this whole sensory network. And that's actually where we create the escape network throughout the campus. These last two slides very quickly are also images by the brilliant Stuart Nielsen. He was generous enough to allow me to include his work in my show at the Architectural Biennale in Venice. And when he went to visit our show in Venice, those of you who have been to Venice know what a beautiful city it is, but what a sensory overwhelming city it is. It's crowded, it's hot, it's smelly, there's water, there's history, there's noise, there's tourism, there's retail. It's just very, very dense. And as an autistic person, that was very hard for him to manage. So he uses the lens of his camera to decode those experiences. So he goes back and applies these incredible algorithms. He took his boat ride down the canal, the Grand Canal, and compressed it into this beautiful spiral that allowed him to compress his experiences and code his experiences in a way that he could go back and reflect on them. And this final video, also by Stuart, is something that he created during the pandemic, looking out the window of his home. And he was infatuated and really taken with the pathways of the birds and started recording it and doing these video analysis of it. And he started realizing that the patterns of the flight of the birds in space actually mirrored what was happening in the urban fabric below, which was an incredibly powerful observation. And I just wanted to close with Stuart's work because going back to that very first image of our slides, of that person at the center, if I can leave you with one takeaway from all of this, it is that the next time you are beginning a project and thinking about who that person is, who that user is at the middle of my user-centered design, that based on which I'm going to be making all my programming and design and aesthetic and materiality and contextual decisions, make sure that you really think very carefully of who that person is and consider that that person can be autistic, can be neurodiverse, can have a different identity than the one necessarily that the books of standards and codes and best practices tell us that that person is. And I will close with this and with these codes that you can scan and get some of the references. And I'm happy to share with Kirsty and Minna any resources that I mentioned today that anyone is interested in learning or reading more about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Magda. Such a great and interesting too. So thank you so much for this. We are having a question from one of our attendees. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I am autistic and I'm deeply moved by what you do. How do you think spatial design can be inclusive for autistic people beyond sensory experience and predictable routine/environment, particularly difficulties in social communication?
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much to whoever is that shared that life experience. And I am so grateful to every autistic person I've had the pleasure and honor of working with and hearing from and talking to, because like I said, they are really the source of everything that we have been able to accomplish and come up with. And so much knowledge has come from that space. So to your question about social communication, because I know how much of a barrier that can often be and how excluding it can be, again, because we assume that there's only one way to communicate, which is social, which is verbal, which is face-to-face, which is looking someone in the eye. So the first thing I think that needs to be done is that double empathy. And I'll give you an example. A woman was recently sharing in an article that I read that demonstrates this double empathy really very well, that she was called into her son's school that I think every mother of an autistic child often is. And the teacher told her, we have a big problem with your son. He does not know how to play with his classmates and it's a problem. And he's constantly excluded and being bullied and getting very frustrated and acting out because he doesn't know how to play with his friends. So the mother's response I thought was brilliant. She said, well, do they know how to play with him? And why is it that her son had to learn how everyone else necessarily played a certain game, which probably was very social and based on a certain model of engagement? Why weren't there efforts being made to teach both her son how to play these games, but also the rest of the class to play games that maybe her son was more comfortable with? So part of it, I think, is just changing the way we think about this interaction. So the first thing, and another experience that I had that was incredibly interesting, and I was just talking to a wonderful friend and collaborator, Jose Velasco, who's a vice president at SAP, which is a huge digital tech company, and who runs the Autism at Work in the Workplace initiative. And he was telling me about how many people in his workforce that are autistic, that are part of the Autism at Work workforce, that actually said that they worked much better during the pandemic because they were working remotely. And in working remotely, they didn't have to navigate the elements of the social space of the workplace. And I say that maybe with some hesitance because I don't want to romanticize the devastation that the pandemic had globally and how difficult it was for the mental health and isolation and the challenges that it brought with it. However, being an optimistic person, I like to look at the silver lining. The silver lining is that we now have a world that is set up to have that double empathy, that perhaps our meetings don't have to be in person. I don't have to necessarily have my camera on when I'm running a meeting. I can do it just with audio and still engage. I can plug in my comments to a presentation with a text and comment on like a shared Google Doc or something. So as a result of this new remote virtual world that we were thrown into, for better or for worse, has emerged these strategies that I'm hopeful will stay in place and that will allow for more availability for different modes of social interaction. Not that I don't think social interaction is crucial and essential, but I think autistic social interaction is just different. It's different than what that typical quote unquote normative social interaction looks like. So I think we need to work on it on many fronts. And the final thing I'll say to our attendee is that what I have experienced is that when we put these spatial strategies in place, that ability to engage socially, because sometimes one of the reasons that it's hard to engage socially is because your mental and psychological bandwidth is so occupied with just surviving the overstimulation of space. So going back to the slide with the purple pods, one of the most beautiful results of the purple pods is that students that had, prior to having these purple pod transition spaces in their school, had never initiated a social interaction. When they are sitting in the purple pods, they will now reach out and stop a teacher that taught them last year, call their name, ask them to come over and sit. And that, to the parents and the teachers of the school, was the biggest gain. By creating that transition space infrastructure throughout the school, we automatically created a safe space where students on the spectrum became comfortable enough and didn't have the overstimulation and the anxiety that comes with social engagement, so that they could engage socially in a way. And that was just such a rewarding result of that. So I really believe, and there's evidence to show, that when we do these strategies, we actually can create the ecosystem for these engagements to happen more comfortably.
Thank you. We're having another question that we need to answer briefly because we're running out of time.
Sure.
From Patrick, great talk, and your description of wayfinding and demarcation explains why I like the train station and hate supermarkets. There is a growing recognition that ADHD space, that organization tricks that work for ADHD work for everyone. Does the stimulation control for autistic adults also have benefits for neurotypical people with busy minds?
Absolutely, Patrick. The answer is a very loud yes. So I'll give you one example. In one of the early studies we did when we reorganized a classroom into compartments and put in some acoustical soundproofing, the very first reaction I got was a phone call from the speech therapist the very next day. And she said, thank you for putting in that acoustical modification. We haven't even yet seen how it's affecting the students, but we as a teaching staff can now perform so much better. We weren't aware of how much background noise, how chaotic our classrooms were until you reorganized them. We didn't realize how noisy we were operating within a space until you put in the soundproofing. And so they started being better teachers and able to focus on their tasks. So absolutely, so many of the strategies that we developed, and that's why I think autism expertise is so valuable for everyone, because the strategies translate, and at the minimum, they won't create barriers. They will, I hypothesize, facilitate a lot more productivity and comfort and health and well-being in spaces for everyone. But at the minimum, they won't be a barrier for neurotypical populations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Magda. Thank you again for being here with us today. And without any further ado, we will be moving to our next speaker.
Thank you, Minna.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Alyssa Anselmo. Alyssa is an interior architect who creates beautifully inviting and innovative spaces. She received her bachelor degree in interior design, interior architecture and design, where she studied in Florence, Italy. Alyssa specialized in creating memorable spaces which embody a sense of hospitality with a network of graphic elements and precise detailing. In the last few years, she has worked between New York, Stockholm, and Canada, trying to make a difference in how we perceive our day-to-day environments and prompting others to ask themselves, why do I feel the way that I feel in this space? And today she will be talking about Bambini Holistic Children's Daycare Center. Over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. And I don't even know how to follow up that last presentation because it was so thoughtful and informative. So without further ado, let me just try and share my screen here. Do you know where the share screen option is? Oh, I see it here. Okay, it's in green.
You can see your screen.
Okay.
And can you try just to, we don't see anything yet?
Oh, you don't see? Okay, let me just check.
No. Are you sharing your whole screen or just the application screen?
Right now I'm sharing the application screen.
We can see it.
Okay.
Can you stop sharing, yeah, and reshare? Maybe try the screen this time.
Let me see. Okay, I'm gonna try again.
Yes, can you move so we can just check if it's moving?
Okay, is that good?
We're still in the first slide. We can see only the first slide.
Could I just help you? Sorry, this is Shibu Raman.
Yes,
Yes.
Yeah, there's a problem while sharing PDFs. So if you share just the application, it does not progress from one to the next slide. Instead, if you share the whole desktop, it'll do it. You know,
okay.
there's some glitch in the Zoom.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me check.
No worries.
Share screen, desktop. Okay, and then now, how can I share view screen mode? Okay, now?
Yes, can you just try to move to the other slide so we can check?
Does that work?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so today I will be talking about the making of a Reggio-inspired holistic early learning center. So my name is Alyssa Anselmo. So I am an interior architect. I'm 28 years old. I am originally from Edmonton, Alberta, which is a Western city in Canada. So I grew up there my whole life. I lived there for about 18 years. And I grew up to two Italian parents. They were both born in a small village in Italy. And whenever I would go there, we would go maybe every few years. I started seeing a contrast between North America and Europe overall, specifically where I was from, of course. Edmonton is a oil town. This is what it looks like. So in the winter, it gets to minus 50 degrees Celsius. It's a very cold city. So many people moved there originally to make money in the oil industry. So lots of people work in trades. They work as electricians, plumbers, firemen. So it's very common there. And I don't know, growing up, I just had such a lack of a creative feeling or a creative passion, a push in that area, because everything was mainly designed with functionality rather than functionality and aesthetics. So then when I would go to Italy and travel with my parents, I started seeing so much beauty, so much history and culture, and the architecture, everything was so much more thoughtful in my eyes. And so, yeah, this started when I was quite young. I think the first time I went there, I was 5 years old. And I also started noticing at a very young age that in TV shows that I watched, in day-to-day environments that I went to, everything was affecting me so much, but I just couldn't understand why. So I was very overwhelmed. I was very anxious in very complex, busy places. For example, if I went to a restaurant that was all painted red, all the walls were red. I would go home and I almost felt depressed. I felt like I witnessed a death or something. It was very, very severe for me. But again, I couldn't understand why. So the TV, the cartoons I would watch, I would always pick very simple storylines with not too much going on, no crazy car chases or big moments. It was rather really subtle color palettes and minimal talking. It was rather me focusing on the music in the background and the geometry, the patterns. So I started thinking that I had to do something. There was something creative in me that was pushing, and I wasn't sure what. So I started expressing it through things like music and maybe fashion, just like things at a young age that I started taking interest in, or I would paint when I was at home. So then through going to Italy all of these times, every time I came back, I told my parents, I'm moving to Italy. I'm moving to Italy. One day I'm going to move there. And I actually found, I think I was 10 years old. I found a school in Florence that was an interior design school, an architecture school. And I said, I'm going to go to the school as soon as I turn 18. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to make all my money. And my parents were so angry at me because they said, you know, we left Italy. We left during really bad times. They came with their parents that were in the war. And they said, we just came here for a better life for you. And now you're going to go back there after all the sacrifices we made. And I just said, like, there's something, I have to be there. I'm not sure what it is, but I just knew I had to go. So at a really young age, I started working really hard. I had multiple jobs from like 12 years old, whether it was shoveling someone's front driveway because there's so much snow in the winter. I got a lot of jobs at cafes, restaurants, waitressing, and so on. And then so finally, when I was 18, I saved up like, I think $30,000 from all of the work that I had put in. I think I was working 2 or 3 jobs at a time, and my parents couldn't afford anything. So it was good. They taught me to take care of myself. So I just got up and I went to Florence, Italy, and I moved there. And I attended the Florence Institute of Design International, which I studied interior architecture for 3 years. And on top of that, I learned about furniture design, graphic design as well, and lighting, acoustics, 3D printing. So it was a very well-rounded program. And when I just got there, I was very confused because I felt like I was back at square one. So here I am, I came to this school in Italy, in Europe, and most of the students were European. So they had already this life of history and architecture, and compared to the city that I grew up in, I just felt like I didn't know as much about creativity. They were all like, all my friends that I started making were so good at drawing, at painting, at fashion, at everything. They had such a creative spark to them. So I felt very behind in trying to discover who I was and leave the Edmonton girl behind, sort of thing. So after the graduation, I had an amazing experience there. I learned so much. I knew that design was for me. I knew that I could try and make a difference and influence how people feel in their spaces, because I knew that there had to be something different. So I applied for jobs and I got a job in New York. So that's where I got a job at A+I, which is Architecture Plus Information. So it's a company, it's a mid-sized company, and they design office headquarters. So this was my first job and I was very excited. I flew to New York right away, directly after school. I worked here for about 1 year. And at the end of this year, I got a call from my mother. And my mother, her name's Teresa, she owns a childcare center called Bambini Learning Group. She's had this center for about 30 years. Originally, she didn't have any university experience. She didn't have anything. She just felt like she had to work with children her whole life. She had 4 kids of her own. And so she started this center. She bought a daycare center. It wasn't a daycare center. It was actually a hole in the wall that she paid all of her savings for. And she worked for years. She started with maybe 7 children. In that time, my father got paralyzed, and so she was taking care of him and the 4 small kids at home while being an immigrant in a new country. And it was a lot for her. So I knew my whole life that she had such passion in children. Otherwise, she wouldn't be doing something like this. So I got a call from her when I was in New York, and she said, listen, I'm thinking of expanding my daycare. At the moment, it's called Ages and Stages, but I've always wanted to call it Bambini, which I'm sure some of you know means children in Italian. And so she said, do you want to help me expand these centers? I know that you've been wanting to design your own spaces, and maybe you're a bit, it's only been a year, but maybe you're tired of corporate workspaces. Do you want to help my vision come to life? So I said, okay, absolutely. I'm down for this. So I actually moved to Stockholm, where I'm living right now. I've been here for about 3 years. And I started working from online for her. So basically, her program was always Montessori, and she transitioned into Reggio Emilia approach early on. So this is actually a photo of a center that I designed for her. This is the first one. So the one that I'll be presenting today is the one that I started designing a year ago, and it's now complete. But this one was the one that I designed, my very first daycare. I designed it by myself, and it was my very first project solo. So basically, the Reggio Emilia program is a child-led program, and it has very high respect for the individual rather than a pre-programmed curriculum. So there's no preset circle time. We're not for sure doing this activity today. There's no set activities that go out to the parents for the curriculum for the whole week. It's basically child-led and day-to-day. So at Bambini specifically, they have a lot of nature walks. They take children on walks just to discover their everyday environments outside, to connect with nature. They do yoga, they do meditation. Let's say if they're going for a walk and one of the children picks up a pine cone and says, what is this pine cone? Like, what is this thing? Then maybe the teacher will grab a bunch of pine cones and be like, you know what, let's learn about this today. Like, some of the kids are interested in it. So we'll go back, maybe we'll paint with them, maybe we'll learn about trees. So it's a very interesting program, and it's really nice to see that, if you have children sitting at a table for lunchtime, maybe one child is full and just ate and doesn't want to eat. They're not sitting there being forced to have a spoon in their mouth. Maybe they want to experience with like shadow play in the other corner. So the teacher will go with them in that corner and see what they're really interested in at that given moment. So as we know, like, the physical environment really impacts how children learn and how they behave. Some environments can make children very anxious or overstimulating, like the previous presentation that we just heard. There's a lot of factors in that. And for me as a designer, and looking at my mother's, I guess her competitors early on, and how she used to have her centers, they were all just full of colors, just full, and they were such saturated colors. Sometimes it's not about the actual amount of colors, but also the depth and just how saturated and bright they can be. So it was very overwhelming, low ceilings, it's ceiling tiles everywhere, and just really small windows, barely any natural lighting. And I was thinking, when I was a kid, that really impacted me. I was very highly sensitive. I may not have been autistic, but I was very highly sensitive for whatever reason that was. So I just knew that I had to create something different. And I knew that because this is my first project by myself, I was extremely nervous, but I just knew through the years of seeing childcare, and even when I was younger, I used to go to work with my mother, and I would, volunteer on field trips and stuff like that, and I would read to the children. And so I kind of got a feeling of day-to-day programming, so I understood where certain corners in the rooms have to be and so on. So yes, this is a photo of the first daycare that I designed. So everything is according to age group. So the ergonomics change, The accessibility definitely changes. So this is like a toddler room. So basically, I was really excited about this project because I knew that my aesthetics and my beliefs already aligned with what my mom was trying to do here at the center. And I really like to think that in environments, it's important for me that that materials speak for themselves. So I tend to focus on natural materials themselves rather than bright pieces of furniture or anything that's just an actual object. I think it really says something when you walk in and have this blank canvas of beautiful materials that make you feel something from the moment that you walk in the building. And it's something that you'll never forget. So I was thinking, imagine a child feeling the same way. Maybe they can remember this space 20 years from now. They'll have like a slight subtle memory of a space that made them feel nice or made them learn a certain way. So I thought it was very interesting when I started learning about the Reggio approach and how everything works compared to other approaches. So basically, I knew we had to have non-invasive colors, so very soft tones. Again, this is a photo from the first daycare that I designed. So another interesting thing to me is that for the Alberta regulations for codes for childcare, they need fluorescent lighting in daycares. And I just thought that was absolutely insane to have all these children gathered in one building, which is already overwhelming for them every day, 8 hours a day, and you have blaring fluorescent lights in their faces. And when I questioned about it, they said it helps children draw better. It helps them see their drawings better. So I was just thinking, okay, that has to go. This has to be different. Like, why can't we have children feel like they're at home or feel like they're in a welcoming, warm space? Like, these fluorescent lights are completely white. So the first thing I knew I had to do was I had to get gallery lighting, something that almost feels like an art exhibition, some track lighting, something, and I tried to warm it up as much as I could. The second thing I knew I had to do was have tall ceilings, really high ceilings, just so that we can make the windows as large as possible to allow a lot of natural sunlight. So this was kind of weird for me because here I am, I'm this new, like, I think I was 25 or 26, 25 at the time. And I'm having these conversations with developers and I'm trying to convince them, like, no, we need taller windows. We need the windows starting at the floor. We need skylights. We need really high ceilings. And they're thinking, I don't think so. Like, we usually design daycares and everyone's fine with low ceilings and no windows. So I was really trying to convince this and get our concept going through. So another big thing of Reggio is they have really minimal colors on the toys as well. The toys are generally wooden and try to eliminate as much plastic as possible. So I knew most of our toys that we would purchase would be wooden. So that's where I incorporated wood paneling. So I wanted some wood paneling or wainscoting, as we'll see in the current center that I designed, traveling around the walls just to give that extra bit of warmth so the sunlight would reflect on that wood. So most of the toys that we did choose ended up being birch, almost kind of like an IKEA feel to it, which was really convenient because IKEA sells a lot of great things for children. So we had a lot of earth tones and we had the floor plan be very open, mainly because there is, in Reggio philosophy, they have sort of a piazza or like an internal courtyard, just as they would in Italy, how they have cathedrals and piazzas. Where people gather, they eat together, they drink together, they go to church. So in the Reggio approach, typically they'll have something like that where all of the children will eat together. So it's kind of a fun part in a day where children can connect at different ages and learn about each other's day while eating together. So what we thought to do, because Bambini has they have a yoga instructor, they have a meditation coach that comes in with the children, they wanted to have their separate space for that. So I created a piazza, an internal courtyard, where all of the other classrooms would wrap around typically. So that kind of created, we had the youngest children on one half of the daycare, and they had enclosed rooms for nap time and for overstimulation, because daycares can get quite loud. Then we had the piazza splitting right down the middle to all the older children on the left side. So it was very interesting for me. I had to learn a lot about biophilic design and how nature affects people, and people work so much better as well and learn and develop better in well-lit spaces. People are used to, in our day-to-day lives, we sit behind a cubicle with, again, this bright fluorescent lighting. And for me, that's so frustrating. And I just wanted to bring something different. And especially, again, to Edmonton, Alberta. It's like something that, no one ever heard. And when I was talking about this project to a lot of my friends and family, they were just thinking, this is crazy. Like, I don't think anyone's going to take to this, because this is an oil city. So I don't think parents are going to be interested in how much sunlight is coming into your daycare. They just want something close to their house. So I thought it was really interesting. So again, this is a photo of the first center that I did. So you can see all the natural lighting, and this is just to give you an idea of how Bambini is currently operating. So lots of wooden toys, lots of foam as well, very neutral tones, lots of sunlight coming in. These are the little wooden toys. I just love how this is coming back. And I had so many conversations with people born way before me, and they were all saying, I love these wooden toys. This is what we grew up with. And I have so much fun, even unboxing these toys while I was setting up. It made me feel nostalgic, because I just thought, this is so much more interesting than having plastic bright toys in your face all the time. I love the wood and the soft, subtle colors. It's really going to affect the children, and you can see that day to day. So I began with my mood and my concept. So as I mentioned, the use of materials was very important, and I started doing a lot of material studies and research to find the perfect materials, and I came up with this mood board that I created. And this mood board really started with one material in particular, which was this piece of stone right here, this little square piece of stone. I had seen a photo somewhere online of a green countertop. And this texture, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it came from, but I saw a photo and I kept it as a reference. It didn't look anything like this piece of tile, but I just thought, okay, we need to have green as a color to pick from that will form and shape the rest of the center. Because I thought we're going to have neutral tones. The first daycare I designed, I used all natural wood. And I used white, like pure white walls as a blank canvas. So I thought, I need to warm this up slightly, and I would really like to see just a touch of color, but I want to bring the outdoors in. So if I can mimic some kind of green and incorporate more biophilic design, then we can have some nature feels going around here, and the children maybe will feel like they're in a forest all day, like who knows. So with this mood board, that first piece of countertop that I found, I was thinking, okay, if I find some kind of green terrazzo, I'm not sure I want to deal with terrazzo because, sometimes it can be a bit trendy, it can be a bit Pinteresty. So I found this piece from a company in Toronto, and they make them in Italy. And it's a mixture of Corian, concrete, glass, and marble. And it comes into this beautiful piece. So once I found this piece, I got them to ship it to me in Stockholm, and I created the mood board, and I said, everything's going to revolve around this countertop. So that's where I got this green color from here. It was picked, like color picked in Photoshop directly from this piece of countertop. And so I started putting everything together. I thought, okay, we're clearly going to have birch to match the toys, to feel warm. We're going to incorporate some textures, some soft, subtle textures, so it feels more comfortable, because sometimes if you have a really large building, like this daycare is 10,000 square feet, so 1,000 square meters. If you have a building this big, you want to incorporate a lot of soft, comfortable and cozy textures for the children to cozy up in. So then after that, I knew we had to have a lot of plants. So I thought to incorporate a large tree right in the middle of the piazza. Then I also used some black for all of the hardware and all the accessories. And then this time, instead of putting stark white walls, I used a beigey cream color, like an eggshell white, so that it's a little less overwhelming on the eyes, it's less harsh, and it brings warmth. And this is especially important, I think, in Reggio approach, because the children use the blank canvas. Their environment is a blank canvas. So if they're hanging artwork around, you don't want too many things going on. You don't want crazy colors on the walls. So we typically hang all of the artwork at children's eye level so they can see what's going on. And it's just really nice to have that blank canvas. So again, this is a photo of the first center that I designed. So some of the challenges that I ran into were, the first one being very obvious. I'm very, very young. I had no experience prior to the 1 year in architecture at A+I New York. So I had to come into this with the thought of, I either go big or I go home. So I either present my concept as strongly as I can, and I get people to take me seriously, or I just cave in and all my details are just out the window, and this might just look like every other daycare center. So that was the biggest issue. I would meet with the developers, it was a room full of 25 older men and contractors, and they just looked at me like I was 12 years old. So it was something definitely that I had a hard time voicing my opinions and trying to get things out there, where there were a lot of issues with the building codes in Edmonton as well, because they're so used to building these industrial buildings that it is function over aesthetics completely. So for example, I said, we need all of the faucets, all of the taps in the sink to be black. And I had this like rounded faucet in mind. And they said, that's not possible because we can't find one that is CSA approved in Canada. So I tried, it probably took me months to find one that had to be an automatic faucet because it is in a public children's space. And it has to be CSA approved. And then on top of that, it has to be black. So I was trying to find, and I think there were 2 in all of Canada. And one, we had issues with shipping, so we had to pick the other one. So there were these little forms of availability that affected my design greatly, more so than when I lived in New York, or if I were to pick up a project in Stockholm. So these are things that I had to really adapt to, and I wasn't used to at the time. So coming from New York, we had these high budgets. I think the very last project I worked on, we had a $3 million budget just to furnish 1 floor of a building. And I just thought, that is crazy that people spend this kind of money on furniture, until I really realized and appreciated designers' work. And I saw that people will spend $40,000 on a sofa. So then I came to work on a daycare, and I had to get things very, very cheap, basically. So I was trying to come up with innovative concepts that would also be able to be functional in the sense of budgeting. Like, can we actually build this, or do we have to get this wood from China, or how are we going to make this happen in time with shipping? Another huge thing that we faced was COVID shut everything down. So things that I ordered a year in advance still were stuck out to sea somewhere. And I didn't know how to handle any of this, because I was just like, okay, I have to find alternatives. And, this was my first time. So another thing that was a really big challenge was the structural freedom. So as I was mentioning before, I wanted to incorporate skylights with a lot of greenery below, so that children can come into these environments and feel like they're actually outside. They can learn from their everyday environments because they already do gardening outside and such things like that. So how fun would it be as a child to come into your daycare every day and see all these plants growing with you, and the materials as well, because these materials are changing with time, with sunlight, everything. So as I was saying, I wanted to put a large tree in the middle of the piazza. And I remember the developer's face, and he just said, I'm having nightmares about this tree every night because we cannot install a tree in a building. And I said, I have seen so many trees installed in buildings. There has to be a way. I live in Stockholm now, and every office that I go to might have some kind of tree or skylights or something in the building, but we had to battle a lot of these things because of the climate. If we have skylights, you know, there's meters of snow that are going to cover it through the whole winter. So is it worth it? Are we going to have a lot of leaks? Then once the lease goes up in 20 years, if someone else takes over this building, do they want to deal with a tree in the middle of this room? Do they want to deal with leaking skylights? So the developers were quite hesitant to do this. And so it took so much pushing for me, maybe like 6 months just to make one decision about, you know, we need this tree. So another thing was the furniture availability. So because I had been working in New York and such, I was used to getting furniture from designers because that's what we were supposed to do at the firm. So I had all these amazing designers in my head, and I was like, okay, we can get the chairs from these people, we can get sofas from these people. And then once I got to Edmonton, I realized that there was such a lesser amount of beautifully designed items, and that's just how it was. A lot of people will buy their furniture from like Amazon or IKEA, which I think is great, but it's a very very large contrast between what I was used to. So for example, those moments led me to have to be more creative. I had to contact other people to say, okay, I really, really want this this table, but I can't buy it. So let's try and find someone that can make it and can make it for this price and can make it using my materials, because this is not something maybe that they're used to. So even if I show them a photo of exactly what I want, in AutoCAD, I draw up everything exactly, the measurements, how it should be, it might not come out the same way. So I was prepared to endure that. And that kind of led me to something like this. So this is like a lobby desk that I designed in the first daycare. And I remember looking on the market for months and I said, we need a lobby desk, but they all are so, I don't know how to explain it. They all looked very cheap, and they were all maybe like some bulky object that just your brain directly gravitates towards that when you walk to the space. So I said, I really need to build something that matches the space and has this beautiful synergy between the materials. So I found a local mason, and we chose these little terrazzo glass pieces and we poured them into concrete together. I drew everything up for him. We had like all the molding prepared. It took him months and months. He's never designed anything like or created anything like this. But then, you know, at the end I said, I'm so much happier that I got to do something like this, because then I have this personal piece that I can always have, and I know that it's mine. So I think it's much, you know, you're led to these different circles of creativity when you're limited. And I think that's really important too, as a young designer, to understand. So now I'm going to show you the space. So again, this was a daycare that was designed in a new area in St. Albert in Alberta. And the space is on a fake beach, sort of. So it's a new neighboring community that they're building, and they're building a ton of new houses facing this sort of beach that only the locals in that area are able to attend. It's sort of like a membership thing. So I'm going to show you the space now. And this is the lobby. So this is the front entrance. As soon as you walk into the first doors, this is what you see on your left. So you can see the wainscoting, the birch wood, and how it really brings the warmth together. I wanted to use very minimal materials and colors as well. So you could see just a very small amount of color here, which is literally coming from the plant. And it just creates a very welcoming environment. Most people that walked into this daycare said, is this really a daycare? Because it feels like a hotel or something. And I really like hearing people's assumptions of what the building is before you actually tell them what it is. And I really think that these are the spaces that that children as well as adults need. So this is the lobby desk, and this is still part of the front entrance. So just behind here is actually an office. And so it's kind of like a curved, rounded office that separates from a U shape of the entrance. So when you walk in, you can go either on the right side or the left side of the office. And this was also something that I knew had to be part of the design. So I presented a drawing showing these, all of these slats on the wall. And we tried for months and months to find these tiles that we could dip in paint. And I said, I want this gradient-like effect, and I want it coming off of these sage green-like colors, just to create something, you know. It's the first thing that you see when you walk in, and you just look up and it creates this very serene space, and you don't even know that there's an office inside there. So we searched for months. It was too expensive. We ended up finding a local that was able to create these MDF tiles, and they were quite large, and it took them a really long time. We had to transfer them all to a separate building. There were like a couple thousand of them, and we had to paint them in that building, sand them, paint them again. It took so much time, and it was so satisfying to actually watch this come to life, because I saw how much people were working. We also had the time limit of, we had to be open by March 31st, and the contractors started building on, I think, sometime in January. So it was unbelievable how fast they got this done. And to me, it's still a miracle. I don't understand how it worked. So this is the wall. And as you see, if you keep walking on this left side here, it leads into the piazza, which is that indoor courtyard that I was mentioning. So again, this is the office from the back view, and I incorporated these little cloud-like floating chairs, which the kids love. They're swivel chairs. And these also match the cloud, which is here. So as you walk into the piazza, I have the tree finally, which they did end up passing. Originally, I had it built in the ground, but that didn't pass. So we ended up building a planter, and you know, there's a lot of issues sometimes in construction, so they weren't able to pour the concrete at the same time. So we had to, you know, come up with a last minute solution. We just wrapped it with some kind of foam that doesn't match clearly. But as you walk through, there's these beautiful open windows, and this is all open air ceiling. There's wooden panels, birch panels, slats across all three walls in the room. And then they lead you to this little pit. It's a little conversation pit. And I put that there specifically for children to just be able to observe the cloud and feel like they're in a dreamland. And this is specifically a space that I wish so much that I had when I was a child. And I think subconsciously I built this specific room for that. I felt like this would be so magical as a child to just lay under this cloud and float away. So I spoke with this very talented man named Richard Clarkson. He's from New Zealand, and he built and designed the cloud. And I worked with him to get the exact size. So he has ones that you can directly buy online, but they're already a set size. So I said, we need a huge one that's actually going to cover this pit. So he actually built it for me. It took him months and months, and he sent it. And I think it was about 200 kilos. So it's quite large, but I just knew that we needed this cloud. So I think this would be the most influential part of the whole building, because when the children come in and they see this, they just immediately gravitate and run towards it, and they just lay under there and gaze like they're gazing at the stars. So I think this really influenced the children. So as I said, I tried to get some skylights in there, and after a while of fighting, we finally got this little skylight, just a little patch, a rectangular one, just above the cloud. So we also got one above the tree. But it's so telling, because I just imagine, oh my goodness, if we had the ability to have all glass ceilings in this space, it would be incredible. I hung a bunch of these hay rice paper lamps too, just to create that different perspective feel, so the children do feel like they're in a magical space. So this is just another viewpoint. I grinded the concrete down really well to expose the stones to have this beachy feel because it is on a beach. So I thought it would kind of feel like sand. And you can just see the children really loving this space and of course running around in circles. We even got the guy that actually installed all the concrete. He grinded the edges down very, very well, and he beveled everything, so he knew how to work in environments with children so that nothing's too sharp. And these are the children just reading. And I mean, I was photographing these children myself for a few hours, and they just kept running towards this cloud and they were looking up at it, and it also lights up. So it's really fascinating. He also has some models that thunderstorm, but they were quite expensive. So I just stuck with this one. So I'm not going to show all of the classrooms. I'm just going to show maybe one or two. This is the toddler room. I wanted to show it because most of the classrooms have a similar layout anyway. So I don't want to bore you guys with the whole entire project, but this is the toddler room. So I basically started with these curved arch doors, and this was a huge thing that I think we went back and forth for about 4 months, and they kept saying, you know, we can't design these arch doors because people in Edmonton, the contractors have never done this before. So they're not quite sure why you want to do it. They think it's a stupid idea. They don't think it's going to look good. And I think you're going to waste your money. So they wanted to charge, you know, I think $50,000 or 50,000 pounds to just make 10 doors. So in the end, we had to get someone local, and we had to work with them to get all the measurements proper. And in the end, this is what it looked like. So there's like this little kitchenette in each classroom, so the children can wash their hands at the same time as the teacher. So I had kind of like this waterfall effect that goes down so that the kids have the opportunity to do that at the same time. And then there you can see the wainscoting that goes halfway up the wall. And then above that is just that green sage color that I chose. And every little detail took so many months. I think I worked on the project for over a year, but I even remember choosing that specific green. I went to so many stores. I sent so many photos back and forth, and I just knew it had to be this green, which obviously looks different as well on the screen as it would in person. So you can just really see how much fun, like the kids, for them, when I was photographing them, it was like this la la land. And it was so exciting for me to watch the children in this space and how different they are. They just look like little, like elves. They're so adorable seeing them go through these little arched doors. It looks like a hobbit house. It's just, it was really exciting for me to see this project go through. And yeah, here you can see them using some of the toys. And we even got this like little hot air balloon that I got from a woman in Poland that designed it from Etsy, and she designed it to like match the actual space. So it just shows like how much detail I put into every single part of the design. Even on the kitchen, like the knobs are perfectly rounded, so everything has these rounded shapes. I'm going to try and go very quickly, but just some more slides here. So this is the art atelier, which is an art room specifically for children to do sculpturing, painting, drawing, anything they want. There's no classrooms in here. This is for children to just come and get creative. So we created this space knowing that we're not making any money off of it. It's not a classroom that we can actually take children and charge for. It's just a free space like the yoga and meditation courtyard, where we just thought children need some kind of creative outlet. So we filled these back drawers like full of art supplies, and I installed these like different hanging poles that we could hang all these plants at different heights just to alternate the perspective a bit, like I did in the courtyard, and have like even the plant pots mimic the pendant lights above the table to have like this little mushroom head effect. So everything's just very designed in mind for it to be more fun for the children, more engaging, and for them to be curious about shapes and color and perspective and heights. And it's stuff that they're subconsciously thinking about. So we even have like a little sink here where they can wash their hands, and it's a double basin sink. And then We have a fake skylight installed here, which looks very real, and it changes to different lighting during the day. Like at sunset, it turns pink, so the whole room turns pink. It's just beautiful. So these are also like little things that I had to learn about, and I had to try and find alternative routes because I was in Edmonton. So this is a pre-kindergarten room. So it's for ages 3 to 4, I believe. And so it just shows like the furniture as well that we installed, and the cubbies. These are cubbies, so each child gets their own cubby, and they're so they just really mimic the design. So I was trying so hard not to leave one single element out in the approach. So, you know, having these little arched glass window doorways where children can wave at their parents as they come and go. And it matches the arches in the art room as well. So just having these little elements which also match like the mirrors, and incorporating these really soft tone colors. These are the toys, for example. So they're all wooden and they're very soft tone painted. So like I said, these were really fun for me to actually unpack and see how they worked in the room, because for some reason, everything just worked so well together. As soon as you have a similar kind of wood with the toys matched in that space, everything just came together. Then the sunlight would come in at different times in the day and just overshadow the whole room. And it was beautiful. It was a very emotional experience as well for us to be building it, and for the contractors too. The contractors kept saying, I've never seen anything like this for children. I want to have children just to send them here. So it was really fun for us to see, like, even contractors and parents and employees, everyone was saying, this really makes me feel good. The energy in this space is so, it's like a hug. So this is like the main kitchen that I designed. So we have a cook that actually cooks for all of the children during the day. So I have, again, the alternating countertop height on the kitchen island. So we have like workshops where parents can come in and cook with their children. And yeah, I just wanted this really grand feeling. So I installed these huge pendants. I put these cupboards that are going all the way to the top of the ceiling just to create that grandiosity and that height. And here you can see a close-up of the countertop, which in the end, we couldn't even get that countertop because the shipping was too long and the company wanted way more money than we expected. So we had to find a local guy to create it, and he actually matched it perfectly, except some of the chips are too small. But that's just, you know, these are the things that you have to go through when you're in something like COVID or something that's you have strict timelines or budgets, or this is stuff that I learned in this process being so young. So these are just some more views. And these are the bathrooms. So each classroom has their own bathroom. So you come through these doors, and this is a sink that they had to install temporarily because of COVID shipping. So we actually have like a double basin sink with 2 taps. But here you can just see, like, I've added this like fish scale tile to mimic the beach feel, and the rounded mirror curves to mimic the rest of the curves throughout the center. And of course, these are the little toddler toilets that everyone loves. They're really cute. They're so small. So this is just so you get like an understanding of how I worked really hard to make sure that every single element, even the storage closet or the WC or staff room, everything had so much intention and purpose behind it. And no matter how hard I tried, I wanted to make sure that everything worked really well together. I didn't want to leave anything out. Okay, so last thing I just wanted to say, I was really moved and overwhelmed designing this project, and it was so much work for me, but I think this hopefully can be the new standard in the industry, and hopefully like other programs learn from this, and children, they can see how much children benefit in these kind of areas. And design is just so important, and it really affects our day-to-day, our relationships, how we communicate with each other. Everything is just so important around us, and I really think we need to start paying attention to our environments. And like I said at the beginning, ask ourselves why do I feel this way when I enter a space? Why do I feel angry? Why do I feel sad suddenly? Why do I feel so energized. At the end of this year now, I just created my own studio called Studio Anva. So if you guys want to follow that, like I'm on Instagram and everything, and my website is www.anva.studio. So that's everything. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I really appreciate this. And this has been really exciting for me as well.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Such an amazing journey you took us through. It was really amazing to see what you have gone through and all the details you mentioned. It was really great, and I believe that it's really important for students to see how the practice is different than education, and like all you took us through from when it was a concept or an idea, and how you personally, your own personal experience, have that influence in your work. And I believe it was a great journey you took us through. Thank you so much. A great story, I believe. So a question we have is, have you received any negative responses about your design, bearing in mind many have preconceived perception of what a daycare should look like and a fixed idea on standardized children's education?
Yes, I heard, I kind of cut out, but you said, have I received negative reviews, right? Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And as I was saying, especially in Alberta, people really weren't ready for this. And some parents would walk in and they would say, you know, you have this beautiful daycare, this is where all of our money goes, but maybe you don't put it towards programming when the program is so well thought out and it's so diverse based on so many years of experience. It almost made people angry. Some of the people in the industry, like daycare licensing and such, that would come into the center to approve us, they would give us so much extra things to think about. And they would say, you know, you didn't have paper towels in this bathroom, so I'm not going to pass you guys. So there was a lot of things like that, you know, other daycare centers, they would tell us too, oh, my licensing officer would never say that to me. But, you know, as you create this different standard, people are constantly challenging you and they want you to back things up. So there were some people that came in and said, you know what, this is not enough stimulation, because they were so used to so much colors all the time. So they really thought that we were depriving the children. And it was kind of sad to see, because even people would say to me, like, you know, you don't have any experience because you're only 28. So how do you know that this is a better environment for children? And it's just, you have to explain to people that don't feel this every day, or, you know, like the previous presentation talking about autistic children, just because we don't know what that feels like. It's weird that we question that so much. But yeah, that's how I could answer that. We definitely had a lot of negative and a lot of positive. I must say there was a lot of positive as well. So
yes, exactly. I believe so, especially after the children were engaged and were enjoying it. I believe that might have changed the perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. And children were really thriving in this environment, and you could see immediately how much people calm down. There's like, sometimes there's a child in the classroom that is having a lot of difficulties, like sleeping or something. And you just know, as soon as they would enter this environment, they were the calmest child, and they would always just go sit in a little corner and take a train set and just start playing with the train. And then they didn't want to leave. They were screaming at the end because they didn't want to leave the building. So
yeah. Another question we have is, okay, how much should you insist on your design? As you mentioned, the contractors challenges your design and have taken some steps back, such as the tree and skylight.
that's a really good question. I will say there are sometimes objects that you have to pick your battle for. There were a lot of things in the design in general that did get changed that I didn't even mention because there were so many things. that at the end of the day, I tried to choose my battles and I thought, okay, these are really big objects. People didn't want the cloud, they didn't want the tree, they didn't want the skylights, they didn't want those arches in the art room. And I just thought this is literally going to make or break the design. And I feel it because I know my concept. And I think it is very important at the beginning because contractors sometimes like they're really trying to go with how can we make the most money? How can we work for the cheapest and make the most money, which makes sense. But at the end of the day, you know, sometimes they'd rather do that than focus on your idea. So if you can be very confident in yourself and you actually say like, listen, I've seen a tree. I know that people have trees in buildings, and this is exactly how it can work. And if you present to them exactly how it can work and different alternatives that you can find, it is a lot more work and it's more stressful. But at the end of the day, you're going to get a result that's way closer to your heart. And I think like that's a really big thing at the beginning when you're starting designing at a young age. How I feel is I didn't feel like I had a voice at all in the very first daycare that I did. I was just sitting really quietly when they would say, you know what, we can't put that skylight in. And I would just say, okay, yeah, no, that makes sense because he has more experience than me. So if you do enough research and you understand why you want specific objects in your building and you can make it work, I think it's worth fighting for sure. I definitely think that you as a designer it's important to have your own space and to bring your own thoughts to this world. So if you really felt that creativity and designing is something that you want to do, it's because you're meant to, and maybe you're supposed to bring something beautiful into this world that maybe someone could deprive you of.
Yes, I think that is really encouraging to hear, especially for students who can sometimes, you know, draw back from their main concepts, like they're afraid to go through it and to argue about their concept. Yeah. I think this is really encouraging. Yeah. I believe so. The challenges you faced with the regulation or the conflicts sometimes you may have with the regulation, do you think that there is always like I'm sorry, am I clear or can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, yeah, the question again. Did you have any other challenges that you faced during the design from conflicting with the local regulation other than the light conflict? And how did you cope with that? How did you support your concept looking at the regulations? Because it could be tricky sometimes.
Yeah, that's another good question. I think we mainly had issues, of course, with like the ergonomics and the size of the classrooms. So the classrooms have to be, you know, you need like 1 or 3 square meters per child. And at the end of the project, when licensing comes in, she physically was measuring the rooms with her measuring tape. And that includes if you have doors that swing into the room, if you have cubbies for the children, you have to deduct that from the space. So I struggled for months trying to make sure, because I remember discussing this with my mom at the time, and she said, you know, if you lose one space, that's thousands of dollars each month or each year. So then I would have gotten in a lot of trouble from that, because there's a lot of specifics that you don't realize, because maybe there was something wrong in your AutoCAD drawing, and maybe when you submitted it, you thought you had more space than you did. You just really never know. So I was very diligent about that. As for other coding requirements, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but the lighting was a really big thing. That really shocked me that was a problem, to have regular home lighting in a daycare. I know that they were reluctant to do a few things, like have such large glass windows. Some people said, okay, but what if there are creepy people or pedophiles looking out the window? And our argument was simply just, I mean, you have windows in your house, they're everywhere. And it's so much more encouraging for these children to have these huge open windows in the day that have all this lighting. They can look out onto their playground, they can watch their friends playing outside as well. And it's just, we had a lot of issues with those kinds of things. So I think that's the best I can answer that, because I can't think of any other coding things off the top of my head, but yeah.
No, this is great actually. Thank you again. We ran out of time, but thank you again.
Yes, thank you so much.
And I will introduce my co-host, Dr. Shibu Rahman, who will be hosting the rest of the session. Over to you, Shibu. You're muted.
Thank you, Mina. Thanks for organizing a wonderful session, the previous session, and I'll take over from here as Mina had to go and attend another meeting shortly. So we have our first speaker for this session, whom I'll introduce in a minute. I'm looking at the panel, and I can see Charlie is already here. Okay, here we go. So Charlie Edmonds is part of the Future Architects Front, or FAF, which is a grassroots level organization of architecture workers and students. FAF campaign actively to end the exploitative practice that have manifested in within the industry. Charlie's a graduate of University of Cambridge and is a system designer at Civic Square. His work at FAF explore the future of architecture labor organizing and its role in the struggle for both social and climatic justice. Charlie, over to you for your presentation, which is I'm sure you can share the screen now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'll do that. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. So yeah, just to reiterate, I'm Charlie, and I'm one of the co-founders of Future Architects Front, or FAF, which is a much more enjoyable way of saying our name. So that's the one that I usually encourage people to use. So today I'm gonna start with maybe a slightly baffling first slide, which is these three logos. And don't worry, I'm not trying to connect with you through architecture in jokes about coffee drinking or ordering model parts last minute or the debate on Mac versus PC. The reason why I'm showing you these logos is because they're all very, very relevant to the larger context to which I'm going to be speaking to today around the role of labor and specifically labor organizing within the field of architecture. So I'll leave that there as a little bit of a teaser right now, but we will get back to these, I promise. So where we're going to start properly then is with this graph here, which is a graph that shows the way that productivity and compensation, or wages, salary, have changed over the last 50 years. So you can see that up until the end of the 70s, both wages and productivity were coupled in the sense that they generally followed the same rate of increase. So you produce more value through your work, you receive more through your compensation. In the 80s, however, we saw a decoupling of productivity from the actual compensation that workers receive for what they do. And this decoupling has led to a stark difference between the way that productivity has increased over the last 50 years and the way that we're being compensated for this productivity. So fair warning, a lot of this first part of the talk is going to be very depressing, but I hope that by the end of it, we will find a sense of more revolutionary optimism together. But stay with me through this grueling introduction of how bad things are right now. I promise that there'll be light at the end of the tunnel. So this is a larger economic picture, right? This isn't necessarily just to do with architects or architecture. But if we do want to look specifically at architecture, and if we do want to specifically look at architecture in the UK, I think one of the most relevant and important details about architecture in the UK is this one. The fact that in 1976, 49% of all UK architects worked for the public sector. That means that about half of all architectural work was done with public money in the interest of the public good. So this would have contributed to things like the massive boom in social housing post-war. This would have contributed to the large amounts of public amenities that were provided, particularly in places like London, again, post-war. Then in 1979, we saw the beginning of Margaret Thatcher's 11-year war against local councils. And essentially, this also marks the beginning of what people refer to as neoliberalism, which is essentially the sort of economic ideology that states that we should cut back on public funding for things like housing, education, social welfare, and allow the markets to take care of these things. And so architects weren't immune from the process of neoliberalism. So you can see that we went from 49% of architects working for the public sector in 76 to less than 1% today. So architecture as a profession in the UK has effectively become privatized. So what this means is it massively impacts the way that we are allowed to work as architects. So no matter how bold our vision, no matter how beautiful our drawings, if the economic container that we're working within does not allow us to do that work, then we are essentially powerless within the face of these larger economic forces. We also see the effects of this privatization, which also led to things like real wage decrease. So I'm sure many people will know that architects are not paid particularly well. A lot of this is down to deregulation of the built environment and the fact that architects were engaged in a race to the bottom, which basically meant that architects would just undercut each other in fees until the point where we're at now, where the profession has become critically undervalued because of this process. And this may have, so again, here's just another diagram that kind of illustrates some of this. So you can see how the way that government spending has changed over the last 50 years is quite dramatic. So particularly investment in public corporations, which would have been something that had benefited architects. You can see how in the 80s that fell off a cliff. Meanwhile, central government spending has risen while local government spending has fallen. So these are all really important, big containing factors that influence the way that architects are permitted to do architecture. And this may also be why architects are generally, according to a recent study of different parts, different sectors in the UK economy, architects are one of the most privileged types of sector that there is. So you can see that we're right here at the top, beating out even journalists and barristers, who are obviously notoriously a sort of well-off and privileged working group. So likely due to the fall of real wages in architecture, the professional body of architects has had to become more privileged in order to offset that material loss through inherited resource and protection. So this is where we're starting from. I did warn you that it was going to be depressing. So what can people do about it? Well, one thing that people can do about the political and economic conditions that they work within is to do something like a strike. So this has been obviously very much in the news recently. The RMT, who represents railway workers across the UK, have been on strike, and They are doing this to improve the job security of some of their lower to middle income members who the average salary is about £30,000. And this is something that they've been able to do because they have a large, powerful union who can back up these demands for better working conditions. So in case anyone's not heard of a union before, I'm just going to do a quick definition. So a trade union is a group of employees who join together to maintain and improve their conditions of employment. This is achieved through collective bargaining and, if necessary, industrial action. So the idea behind unions is that it's supposed to be a redress in the power imbalance between employer and worker. So the idea is that collectively a group of workers can come together in order to have a seat at the table in terms of deciding how they're going to work, to what ends, and under what conditions. So again, let's look back at this diagram then. So how do unions relate to things like productivity and wages and these big sort of complicated economic ideas? Well, let's take this diagram of the decoupling of productivity and compensation, the diagram that shows that the value of people's work is not being returned to them, but is instead being funneled elsewhere. And let's cross-reference that with another diagram, which looks at share of income going to the top 10% of earners versus union membership. So obviously, you don't want to jump to conclusions that correlation is causation, but this is a pretty damning graph that shows the way that union membership is inversely related to how wealth is concentrated in the top 10%. So this diagram seems to suggest that union membership is an effective tool in a more equitable distribution of wealth. And if we combine these last two diagrams together, we get a more comprehensive picture that shows, again, since in the last 50 years, how the largest trends we can observe is a decline of union membership, a rise in productivity, and a stagnation of hourly compensation. So I would put to you that these things are all connected, and that as people preparing to go into the workplace, these are all vitally important factors for you to consider in your upcoming careers. So why did I talk about these guys right at the beginning? Well, it's all good for a group like RMT, who are a very well-established, very large, very powerful union, okay? If you work in that sector, you have a group who can immediately assist you in defending your material conditions as a worker. But a lot of us don't have that. A lot of sectors don't have that. And so I want to take a second to look at some sectors that didn't have that and created it for themselves. So in the last year or two, both Starbucks, Amazon, and Apple have all had major wins in terms of their unionization drives in the US. Now, here's three photos of the various sort of union organizing activities that have gone on from Starbucks on the left, Amazon in the middle, and Apple on the right. These photos are largely taken after they've won various votes to unionize. And you can see how these groups are coming together as workers in order to try and secure better conditions for themselves. Now, what I really want to try and communicate is just how unprecedented this is, because all of these companies are huge, powerful corporate entities, and they're based in the US, which in terms of global standards does not have great protection for workers. It does not have great labor laws. And even despite this, over 150 Starbucks stores in the US have unionized as of this month. And again, just to give you an idea of the scale, I'm going to quote from Stephen Greenhouse. A few months ago, hardly anyone thought we'd see a giant Amazon warehouse unionized, an Apple store unionized, and 158 Starbucks unionized, especially since they're three intensely anti-union corporate giants. Many young workers are evidently very eager to unionize and have a voice at work. So we are in the midst of a very significant labor movement. That's something that can't be denied. And sadly, it's something that you'll only learn about if you're looking for it, because these type of things are not covered very well by large news groups. So you may be thinking, this is great, but what does it have to do with architects? What does it have to do with architecture? Well, let me tell you. So I'm going to start off by quoting quite liberally from Kate Wagner in her letter to a young architect, which was published in the Architectural Review a couple of years ago. And I think this is a great way to base yourself in your position as a graduate moving into the world of architectural work. This is a sort of selection from the larger letter, so I would encourage everyone to go and read the full letter, but I will read some of the most important parts as I see them now. So Kay Wagner writes, of all the professional responsibilities that come with being an architecture critic, perhaps my favorite is participating in design review panels at universities. Student work inspires me, for it is unfettered with the bullshit that comes along with the drudgery of architecture as a profession. For most, this agency ends at graduation, and after graduation, many new architects enter directly into the workplace, and the workplace is not like architecture school. Unless you take the rare step of going straight for sole proprietorship or starting your own firm, you end up at a large firm and take your seat at a desk alongside dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals with the exact same background as you. It is time that you realize that you are something else, namely you are a worker. This is important. This means that you are in a unique political position in society where you can make a difference, not as an individual or as a valorized practitioner of design, but collectively alongside other workers. You may not be able to simply will your political views on ethics or climate change or equitable development through projects and essays like you did in school, but instead you'll make that change from within the workplace through organizing. So again, much like this presentation, I think Kate's letter takes an interesting sweep from doom and gloom to optimism, in the sense that while you may not be able to influence the world in the way that architecture school might have you believe, you still have a significant political power as a worker to make these changes through organizing. So how can you do that? How can architects organize? What does it mean to think of yourself as an architectural worker and allow that to influence how you participate and how the sort of impact you can have on the profession? Well, the easiest example, the most direct example, is that of UVW SAW. So this stands for United Voices of the World, section of architectural workers. So UVW SAW are the architecture union in the UK. They are very, very new. They only started in 2019, and yet they've already gone on to have a significant impact in the UK, and even sort of ripple effects out into the US as well, where we see groups like Architectural Workers United starting to try and form their own unions in the US. So what does this group as a union do? Well, it's not all about protesting, picketing, holding up signs. They also do a great deal of education work and a great deal of collective organizing for people in events that they host. And this is a really great way of building knowledge about your position in the profession, building knowledge about how you can best influence the profession, and building knowledge about how you can operate within a workplace, even besides the actual direct union action that you might participate in. That being said, there is still a lot of protesting if that's something that you enjoy. There's a lot of flares all the time as well. So if you like flares and bright colors, you're going to love organizing in this way, because it is something that always seems to be brought along. But the union is essentially able to represent architectural workers and protect them from things like unpaid overtime, things like poor contracts, things like low pay, for example, things that are rife in architecture and most creative industries, to be fair. A union is something that can give you more protection against these things. So where does FAF come into all of this? Well, we get sent a great deal of messages from people who are architectural workers. They are in the workplace, they're feeling powerless, they're not feeling like they're being valued, they're not feeling like they're being respected, and they're unsure of what to do. And so we sort of operate as a informal organization that can help connect people with the tools that they could best organize politically with in order to improve their material conditions. So sometimes we will encourage people to join the union if their concerns are largely rooted in something like the impact of climate from their work. We'll encourage them to join a group like the Architects Climate Action Network. So we sort of work as an informal go-between between all of these different organizing groups, these different grassroots organizations. But we also have fun with it. So we, I think, have quite an important role in terms of acting as a sort of alternative online education in how architects exist within larger political economy. So we do this through some serious means, like the open letter that we wrote to the Royal Institute of British Architects, and we do this through some less serious means, because you might be looking at this and thinking that it's all very lowbrow, and you would be right, it is lowbrow. That's the point. The idea is that you make the bar to entry into this conversation as low as possible so that you can speak to as many people as possible. Because right now, the thing that we need most in the profession is collective organizing, and you can only have powerful collective organizing if you get a lot of people involved. And it doesn't hurt that it makes it a bit more fun as well. So in terms of the organizing that we've done, so we aren't a union, but we still try to organize in sort of varied and informal ways. And one way that we're doing that right now is through a campaign to get an architectural worker elected as RIBA president. So this position has for far too long been occupied by well-known bosses of big architecture firms who typically will use the president position to represent some kind of relevance, some kind of status quo symbol that they are trying to achieve. So it's sort of an aesthetic position as opposed to a position of real fundamental change. The inherent conflict in this as well is that RIBA is a membership body. The majority of RIBA's members are architectural workers, and yet they have, at least as far as I know, never had an architectural worker represent them as RIBA president. So Right now, the hustings for REBA president are ongoing. There's another hustings tomorrow, and the actual election will be later this month. So everyone who might be a student member, I would encourage you to check out this campaign, check out the candidates and vote. Student members their membership is free. They can vote. There's something like 20,000 of them. So students literally have the capacity to swing one of these elections if they choose to do it. It's just about getting the organizing momentum to do it. So that's something that we're currently working on. We also last year met with the ARB to represent a piece of research we'd done into the sort of homogenous nature of architecture education, the fact that it's currently acting in a relatively exclusionary way, since you can see in statistics throughout architecture education that as you go from part 1 to part 2 to part 3, the people who remain become less diverse and less representative of the population. And so we spoke to them about the need to create more roots into the profession and to create a more a sort of heterogeneity of architectural education rather than a homogeneous block referring to one single definition of an architect. And this was successful. ARB launched a consultation on reforming the way that they regulate architectural education, and the results of this consultation have just come through with overwhelming support to get rid of the part 1 to 3 system and to introduce more roots into the profession. So we will hopefully be seeing this put into policy in 2023, and hopefully this will lead to a much more diverse profession, both in terms of who can be a part of architecture and how you can practice architecture as well. So diverse both in terms of who's invited and what you're allowed to do. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I will leave you with a quote from Catherine Heron that says, "Architects have to work from a political base, and if there isn't one, you have to start it." And I guess if there's a single takeaway that I would like people to have from this talk, it's that going beyond simply seeing yourself as a designer or an architect is really, really important. Seeing yourself as someone with the political agency to organize in order to influence the world collectively is the only way we're going to be able to address any of the huge existential problems that we're facing, from climate to labor to social justice. They're all tied up in our ability to organize collectively. So I'll leave it there. And I think we've got quite a massive time for any questions and things. So let's see how many there are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the presentation and talking through some of the kind of issues of the current employment challenges, especially as young graduates come through many of the schools seeking employment in the sector. Those who are listening online, it'd be great if you can use the Q&As tool at the bottom of your screen to ask any question to Charlie. Let me just check whether there's any question. None so far, so I'll give them some time to take that in and type up their questions. But in the meantime, how do you see FAF organizing themselves to campaign against this unjust practices? And in some ways, do you know who are the biggest offenders of this? Which type of practices, or is it right to assume that the big corporate ones are doing okay or the other way around? Can you give us a sense of like, is there data, enough data to kind of understand whether there's like in a particular sector which is really exploitative?
Yeah, so we typically look at things in terms of sort of position as opposed to sort of person or specific company. And the reason for that is that it's not so like if we take a huge practice like Foster's, for example, if they weren't there would be another massive practice in their place responding to the same economic conditions. So we generally don't worry too much about like the names and the companies that are doing things, because fundamentally the reason for this exploitative conditions is structural and systemic. So the reason why it happens is because of as sort of like a general narrative, we lost the protection of fees. We had undercutting between practitioners, which led to low fees across the board. This then led to massive problems in financial viability of architectural practice. In order to save costs, this was passed on to the most vulnerable people in the profession, the interns, the architectural assistants, in the form of unpaid overtime and low wages. So it's not even necessarily a vindictive moral decision. It is a exploitative logic that is rooted in the very structure to which our economy is organized. So this is why we spend so much time talking about the larger political economic picture, is because if we were to, say, successfully lead a campaign against a practice to get them to stop something, you'd find another practice doing it somewhere else. So the only way to properly address the conditions is to try and address the underlying factors which lead to that behavior. But I mean, that being said, I think you can engage with those underlying factors at a number of scales. So the way I see, to respond to your first question about how FAF organizes, I always kind of imagine it as a series of like progressively larger dominoes. So the tiniest domino is like getting someone to laugh at a meme about how much overtime people have to do. Like, that's a fairly easy low bar thing to get. And then maybe that leads to them thinking, why is this so overwhelmingly common? And maybe that leads to them starting to identify more as a worker rather than as a professional. And then that might lead to them joining a union, which might lead to the union growing, which might lead to architects having more of a political voice collectively, which might lead to better building regulations, which might lead to lower carbon emissions from the profession as a whole. So I kind of see FAF as like trying to get as many of those small dominoes falling as possible. And then occasionally we'll try and do some bigger dominoes as well. Like when we work with like the ARB, for example, that felt like a pretty big domino, but we try and see what we do as political organizing through architecture. So not within architecture. Political organizing within architecture is frankly not very useful because it doesn't address the conditions that architecture has to operate according to. So political organizing through architecture in order to address larger political economy is the kind of organizing thesis that we're currently working to.
I've got a question for you, Charlie. So Kirsty here has forwarded it, or she has written it. She's asking, do you think that reintroducing to public corporations and higher local funding for social use architecture help with the demand for architectural service and proper payment of architects, or even protection towards architect workers?
So the question is, would the reintroduction of more public spending on architectural work help to protect architectural workers? Was that it?
I guess it's what you meant by public corporation is probably more like the kind of Camden architect kind of practices.
Yeah. Okay.
Coming back.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I think to an extent, because if there's, I think you have to look at it within the context that would have to happen within. So for that to have to happen, we would need a massive political economic shift in everything. So we would need like the return of like mass social housing building. We would need a return of like local councils being very well funded. We would need to essentially return to post-war political sort of thinking, basically, which I think would be great. And I think that in that situation, you have better material conditions as an architectural worker, because you're able to benefit from more responsible public spending on things that are socially useful, like housing, public space, etc., etc. So you as an architect will get to benefit from that, and you'll have more job security and higher wages from that. That being said, though, I mean, I think unions are still important in that context, because while, public sector work is more regulated and slightly more secure, there is still a lot of overwork and a lot of problems in public employment. So
I was just thinking about it, like, the workload just shift.
Yeah. So I think,
but also I think there's another issue, like, your first slide shows about the 49%, 50%, half of entire architecture workers in UK was in public sector. And that in some way could be an opportunity, but also challenging, because if you do want to kind of break the mold and do something different, something architecturally or design-wise non-conventional, even in public sector, within the kind of hierarchy and framework of such organization. I mean, I'm talking about things like public work departments in countries like Asia, where Asian countries, where there's a very strict hierarchy of who does the decision making to how it's done, etc. And they still are typically like pressures of overtimes and stuff occasionally. But what you can do within that system is sometimes could also be limiting. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works both ways, because I think right now with the mass privatization of architecture, you may in certain cases have more creative freedom, but you're allowed to work on a significantly smaller range of sort of contexts. Whereas when architects were publicly funded, they were able to hold a very prevalent position in society as mass house builders, essentially. The London County Council used to be the largest employer of architects in the world at one point. So I think, and if you look at the sort of icons of public housing, I think there is a fairly significant range of sort of architectural style and output that you can see coming from these public bodies. I think the way it works the other way is that while you technically have fewer regulatory limitations in the private sector, you have more financial limitations, in the sense that because of the commodification of land and housing, a lot of architectural work is treated as a return on investment, kind of according to that logic now. So it's not so much about your creative expression as it is about value engineering and sort of capturing the land value uplift that creating a piece of architecture will create. And I think, one way that you can really see that very painfully, visibly, is in London right now, with this like new London vernacular style, where you walk the streets and every single new housing project is this same pale brick, like grid housing tower. And like, it's just become the like boilerplate approach for architects, because they know that they can do it cheaply, because brick slips don't cost very much. They know they can get it through planning, because planning loves bricks. And they know that it appeals to clients, because clients see a very significant return on investment from this very efficient building process. So I think you get more freedom in maybe like small private clients, but at the cost of that larger following of financial logic and that larger loss of relevance to public life. So I think it's a bit of a like trying to weigh which one is the most significant kind of outcome there.
I was not suggesting, I was just playing the devil's advocate to see like,
Mm-hmm.
and in some ways, to have a mix of all of this is really, really important, isn't it? Like, if everybody is under that one hierarchy of the government system or public funded system, that causes its own issue. And we have examples of that from around the world. And then you have a complete privatization, which could also lead to exploitative processes, which we also, you very rightly pointed out about various organizations, as well as how it affects our own profession in architecture. So I think it's really, really relevant to kind of see how a mix of this comes together, and there's a healthy debate about it, because what was once regarded as public housing, which were then frowned upon as sink estate, is now being recreated by private architectural practices for the same economic constraint as you very elegantly described just now. And it's that kind of discourse that is not happening in the profession, which is more worrying, and how the younger generation need to get in there to be able to kind of get into that politics of it and come up with ideas and suggestions. The civic engagement of this generation is actually quite important, because staying quietly and doing your work will not necessarily move the debate forward. How do you see it?
Yeah. And the stakes have never been higher with climate as well. That's the thing that really puts a big sort of ticking clock on this, because if it was just social stakes, then you could see how some people could maybe rationalize privatization as maybe like a kind of survival of the fittest kind of logic. But within the context of climate, it doesn't even work according to that logic, because as much as I disagree with that logic anyway, that even doesn't work, because there's no sort of winners, there's no survival of the fittest when you get swallowed by the sun. So that's another important factor that I think is starting to be a lot more present in sort of labor organizing and discourse as well, which is really great. This new group, sort of Green New Deal Rising, is quite an interesting example of that, of this hybrid approach of both like labor, equity, and climate, because they are essentially all entangled kind of struggles. And it's really encouraging to see them be treated as such rather than sort of like being siloed into their own little neat categories.
So look, I've been just asking too many questions. If there is one more last question for Charlie before we end this session and probably take a 10 minutes break to come back to the last one, I would welcome that. Otherwise, we can close the session now. Is there anyone who's you'll have to be really quick. Put your hand up and I'll let you type the question. Is there one last question from anyone? Okay, look like Charlie, we've done really well in terms of the time and having a wider discussion on that topic. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your talk, and I look forward to welcome you and everyone else to the next session, which starts at 7. So we get a little over 10 minutes break for you to stretch your legs and grab a coffee or whatever you need to do. Come back promptly just 2 minutes before 7 o'clock, and then we restart.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
I encourage you to stay online and just switch off the cameras and microphone so that you don't have to kind of struggle to find the link again. Good evening, everyone. So we're back, 7 o'clock, and we've got the final session of today's presentation, and both two small shorter presentation. It's a pleasure to introduce both of them because they are good friends and colleagues from the school or connected to school. We're starting with Phil Henshaw, who is going to present his his talk about degree of permanence. Phil is a former student of WSA, now practicing as an architect and urban designer at Satanka in London. After graduating, Phil worked as a teaching assistant to the MA in Urban Design program at WSA while undertaking an MPhil research degree on the potential for temporary urbanism in the post-industrial Rhondda Valley in South Wales. Phil has spent 5 years in architecture and urban design team at Fletcher Priest Architect, predominantly working on the London Olympics site before joining the current practice in 2013. Phil is also a co-founder of the award-winning design collaborative Russ Henshaw with his partner Leanne Russ, who specializes in temporary intervention. Today, Phil's presentation will include projects from both of these practices. Phil, over to you, and it was a pleasure to have you in this session.
Thank you, Shibu. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me okay over there?
Yes, we can hear you properly, and but I'm not able to see you.
Okay, I shall sort that out. There we go.
Fantastic, yes.
Yes, okay. I'll get straight into it then. I'll share.
Yes.
Great, so hopefully on the screen you can see the front cover, degree of permanence.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay.
Now, Phil, before you start, I noticed that you have a PDF, and we have a known issue with PDF trying to share from Zoom. You might have heard this, me warning others. You may have to share the window rather than the app when you go full screen. Otherwise, the slide doesn't move.
Okay, can I just test that with you? Next slide.
Yeah, we can move. Yeah, as long as you're not going on the full screen mode. This is fine.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thanks for that, Shivu. Okay, so thank you very much. So my talk is called Degree of Permanence. And that's because a lot of the projects I have been involved with questions this sort of idea of permanence in architecture and explores that spectrum between temporary and permanent. So to give you an illustration of what I mean by that, this project lasted for only 3 days, and it was for Article 25, who were a building charity, and they were raising money for the Nepal earthquake back in 2015. So for this project, we occupied a kind of traffic island with this long table structure. And the reason we did this was to draw attention to the site and to attract people during this festival to come and talk about raising money for the charity. So there was a lot of planning that went into this installation, a lot of specialist fabrication, but it only lasted 3 days. It was then taken apart, recycled. So this was starting to question, you know, what is the purpose of these things? What do they do? And well, this particular project, you know, raised money, but also drew attention to a forgotten part of the city. So with that in mind, I want to talk about 3 case studies, all of which have varying degrees of permanence or temporariness, however you look at it. The first project that I'm going to talk about is another festival installation. This lasted for 3 days. And that project is aligned with the sort of the tags of today's talks being user focused. So that one was all about being engaging, experiential. The next project I will talk about lasted a bit longer. So that lasted for 10 years. And it was to do with morphology, contextual integration. Then the last project I'll mention is something I'm working on currently, and that's the refurbishment of a 25-year-old building in order to give it a life for another 50 years plus. And for that, we're testing lots of concepts and bringing those into practice. So that's the sort of structure of what I want to fly through today. So to give you a bit of background about my research and my area of interest, so I'm fascinated with sort of ideas of temporary urbanism. I did a lot of reading into the situationist movement, and I like their attitude and approach to the city. This sort of revolting against the disciplining effect of functional planning. They thought that cities should be playful and subject to this sort of continuous process of construction and decay. And I thought that was very interesting. I then looked at people like Archigram, who sort of famously had quite radical ideas, and they sort of pioneered this idea of throwaway architecture and reorganizing the city. On the right-hand side is an image from Cedric Price. So he was also fascinated with sort of life cycles and urbanism, temporariness, and he explored sort of lightweight structures with fixed short lifespans, and that was always sort of driven by technology. So from that background, I sort of embarked on my Masters of Philosophy degree, and the subject there was to do with shrinking territories, and that was looking specifically at the post-industrial condition in the Rhondda Valley. So I came across this site. It's called the Hetty Colliery in Hopkinstown. So this amazing relic of the coal mining past, and it's just been left to decay. There are no grand plans for its future at the time of the research, and I thought this was terrible. Why is nobody doing something with these sites? And the reason is that it takes years and years to go through the process. So I looked into temporary urbanism. It's been used in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, amongst other places, as a way of bridging the gap between a permanent sort of response to a site and the current status quo. So from finding that particular site, I started recording lots of other sites along the train line. And the more I recorded, the more I found. I then started looking at strategies of how to reactivate these spaces. And they all tended to be quite lightweight, quite expedient, and low cost. From that, I started looking into meanwhile uses, so something slightly more significant than a temporary use. That would be a Kickstarter to more of a permanent response. And finally into proposals and competition submissions that I prepared of how to reactivate the train lines. So that was the sort of background to these sort of temporary projects. So the first one I'll talk about was called Tile Mile. So this was, we were given a brief by a Turkish tile company who wanted to showcase their products in Clerkenwell Design Week in 2014. And they had this fantastic site, which is it's called St. John's Gate. It's in Clerkenwell, 500 years old and grade 1 listed. And it's a public thoroughfare. So they thought they took this site as an opportunity to showcase their tiles. So we had to create an engaging installation, but one that would, but one of the key rules is we were not allowed to touch the existing structure in any way. So it's very challenging. So we felt quite constrained by the limited space within this archway. So we started looking at precedents from Turkey, different techniques of tiling to look at how we could exaggerate that space. And that's when we fell upon the idea of parallel mirrors and how that can create an infinity effect. And it's been used in film and theatre a lot. Examples here in Citizen Kane, more recently in Inception, to exaggerate perspective. So our concept was to line the internal faces of the archway with 50 square meters of mirrors that would be braced against each other. So it'd be a fully sort of freestanding structure, independent of the grade 1 listed artifact around it. And the effect would be that we would be able to reflect the double vaulted kind of soffit of this archway to infinity to create this sort of amazing cathedral-like space. And it would also create an infinite pathway of tiles that would stretch off into the distance. So in order to make this a reality, we had to consider how it would be built, obviously, and the modularization and how we could turn the tile floor into panels. So this is our design for using these different glazed tiles, and the sort of the panel design reflected what was happening in the structure of the ceiling above. So there were 5,200 tiles that had to be laid as part of this. We approached a specialist fabricator who are experts at doing stuff for London Fashion Week, these sort of high pressure installation situations. And we managed to find an expert artisan tiler, a chap called Colin Barber, who was absolutely fantastic. He worked non-stop for 80 hours to tile this thing. And we had to do it in panels. And what you can see in the image on the left is the seam between two adjacent panels. And that would have to be tiled on site as part of the festival. So this is Colin on the right, and he's trying to close the seams between the tiles whilst there are motorbikes, food delivery vans, all sorts of people going through this archway and crunching over the tiles. But the final effect was very impressive. The installation was a big success. It sort of broke Instagram for a few days and was kind of widely publicized. So the tile company was very happy. But one of our big takeaways was that less important was the sort of advertising of the tiles, but was the fact that people for the first time were appreciating the context around them. So I think we spoke to people who would walk under this arch every day for years and they never looked up, unbelievably, and looked at this amazing building. So what we did for the short duration of this festival was to draw attention to that building. So that's one scale of temporariness. So this is a 3-day project. The next project lasted a bit longer. So this one was more of a 10 years affair. So in 2010, we won a competition to design a community garden in Ebbw Vale as part of the Festival of Wales that year. So the brief was that it would last for the festival, but also be a resource to the community for the following 10 years before the broader master plan was implemented. So it was on the site of the former Chorus Steelworks. So when this closed, it resulted in mass unemployment in the area and left a scar on the landscape that has not really, still struggling to recover from it. And this was one of the relics that was left. So this amazing 1,100 square meter basement. And it had this sort of fantastic array of reinforced concrete columns with all the rebar left exposed on the top. So this is what we had to work with. So our design was to create a vertical garden. So we identified 3 local schools and we allocated them space in the basement to cultivate vegetables and to grow climbing plants to teach the children about gardening, essentially. And this is a visualization of our proposal. So we wrapped the concrete columns in rebar mesh that we would use to create allotments. And then our only kind of major intervention were these green chimneys, these additional towers that would create verticality, animate the skyline. And they would also create a framework for greenery to grow out of this very harsh landscape. This is a cross section through the basement and gives you a sense of scale. As with all temporary projects, the budget is always very constrained. So the detail on the left shows how we considered a sort of a bench design that wouldn't touch the concrete columns and would allow for hidden fixing underneath the decking. And you can see the sort of quite striking red towers within the photography. So this was on day one, it's looking very bare. The planting hadn't taken as of yet. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the pink tent during the festival, and then the first glimmer of hope with the vegetables starting to grow around the columns. So it's very unfortunate with this project that the council weren't able to maintain it. They weren't able to bring schools in because they hadn't set that up properly in the first place. So after a couple of years, the site was sort of fenced off and closed, and it's still in the same state 15 years later because the master plan has been slower to be executed. So this is quite an interesting situation. It's an interesting example that sits between permanent architecture and the kind of ephemeral 3-day festival architecture. This last slide for this case study is a permanent sort of artwork that we designed, and this is a cutout from a core 10 sheet, and it shows the schematic of how they would produce steelwork on the site. So this was an artifact that we wanted to last beyond the lifespan of the garden itself. So the next project has a very different lifespan. So it's the refurbishment of a 130,000 square foot office building near Reading. So the brief here was very different to the other two case studies. It was to make the building last for at least another 50 years. So we were working for our client Legal & General, and we had to reposition, rebrand and redefine what was a very tired 90s building. So this is what it looked like a few months ago before the strip out. And as you can see, it's very much of its time. And the client was a bit stuck with how do we reinvent this building? So our initial response was to knock it down and start again, which didn't have much legs because 50% of embodied carbon is typically within the superstructure. So we took a step back and thought, right, how can we work with the existing building? How can we do some tactful interventions, extensions that can give the building a new appearance, enhance its sustainability criteria, and give it more permanence and longevity? So these were some of the ideas. We're going to use the sort of the vast roofscape to increase biodiversity on the site, renewables, and also look at ideas of layering within the facade and how we could use sort of a double skin approach. So this is a visualization of the sort of transformed south facade. So we were able to retain the existing stonework piers between the window bays, and then we would have these new sort of large pop-out bronze windows, and then 2 floors of sort of lightweight extension on the top. One of the main pieces of this project is the kind of the front extension, which we're calling a sort of orangery, almost like sort of traditional British conservatory. And for that space, we looked at concepts of layering in the facade. So we wanted to create this kind of double height entrance hall that would be like a sort of semi-indoor outdoor space. And these sketches are some of our initial explorations into how the sort of layering of structure, facade, and filigree elements beyond that could create quite interesting moments. This sketch shows how we actually developed that into a sort of environmental solution. So working from the outside in, we've got one skin, which is glass louvers that provides an element of shade and allows, basically forms like a winter garden sort of scenario in the void between that and what is the primary curtain walling. And then within the curtain walling, we had sliding doors so that people within the entrance hall could engage with the vertical plants that would inhabit the space between. We then developed that into a sort of collaborative working space, so that the entrance hall would be more than a reception. It would be kind of this transient space that would be animated with the greenery within the winter garden. So this is the current CGI of that space. We're exposing the steel structure using terracotta clay tiles on the floor for their robustness. And then this is sort of tying in with this idea of permanence and consideration of embodied carbon in use and the need to build robustly so you don't have to replace things, essentially. We're using glue-lam timber curtain walling, again, carbon reasons, and to soften the space. And then beyond the timber curtain walling, there is a zone of, there's the zone of planting where it's jasmine we're going for, which is obviously very nicely scented. So in the summer months, when the sliding doors are open, you'll have a sense of being sort of a connection with the outside. So as well as the reception space, as part of the strip out, we also uncovered this sort of fantastic reinforced concrete structure so the building had amazing bones, and we wanted to keep that. And that changed the way that we looked at the fit out of the sort of office space. Instead of trying to line every surface, we just wanted to let the building talk for itself. And we're celebrating, you know, the remnants of the former fit outs and all the scars on the concrete. We're keeping all of that, which is quite interesting. And this is a visualization of our fit out proposal. So it's very minimal. And the idea being that we create a blank framework that has a permanence and a robustness into which there can be more temporary interventions. And it may even allow for the use to change, you know, over the years and the future of the building. So the joy and delight in the scheme happens on the top floor, where we're creating these new event spaces that are linked by these sort of galleried walkways. And in this particular walkway, kind of cloistered sort of environment, where on your left-hand side, you can look into an atrium, and then on your right-hand side, you look onto the main terrace on top of the building. So conscious I finished a bit earlier, but to summarize, I think what those three projects show is the spectrum of permanence or temporariness. And even when you're dealing with permanent buildings, be it a 500-year-old archway or a 25-year-old sort of commercial building, there's opportunities to consider the temporary as a means of intervening. And this final quote, I think, is quite nice because it places the importance on what happens in buildings as opposed to the buildings themselves. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. That's fantastic. You know, I didn't even have to bring out my reminders or anything.
No problem.
Good work, you know, the efficient presenter. I'm waiting for the first question to appear in the Q&A, and while that happens, maybe I can kickstart. You know, on this debate about the degree of permanence, and how do you? I mean, it's a fascinating work what you've shared with us, and it's very difficult for me to figure out like which one is your work and which one is the office work. And it's okay. That's not my question. Sure. It doesn't really matter. I think what's fascinates me is about the impact of the interventions. You know, when you talk about the temporariness, you know, the kind of temporariness of certain installations or the kind of structures, which then brings in other kind of temporary elements within. How do you kind of assess the impact? You know, how do you value this temporariness in the bigger debate? Did you have any conversations or any thoughts about how do you place this place its value in the bigger context of things? And I don't necessarily mean in a financial sense.
No.
But looking at, like, say, how does that walkway that you created and the way you made people look and change their behavior, look at the great listed artifact that they walk through every day for 20 years and suddenly starting to appreciate? How do you kind of value that subtle and its impact?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because I think we are pre-programmed to think that architecture has to be, has to be a building that stood there for 70, 100 years. And that's how we appreciate things. But as part of my research, there's a lot of good stuff that happened in Germany in the early noughties, especially in temporary urbanism. A lot of the work around Berlin, which has obviously changed a lot over the years, and their approach to temporary urbanism I thought was quite inspiring. And their takeaway, they put a real value on the temporary and the short-lived, because they could see the benefit of how it drew attention to site and how it would reactivate something that otherwise would be forgotten. So in the situation that you're talking about in Tilemile, really you shouldn't need to do that when it's this amazing building. But the nature of cities is that we walk past these buildings every day, and there's a lack of appreciation there. But there's also this kind of very carefulness, and if you've engaged with any council, if you try and approach any building of any sort of listing or heritage, the initial answer, and Cadw in Wales are particularly guilty of this, is no, you can't do anything. So as a result of that, these buildings are frozen in time, like the colliery in South Wales, and people are too scared to do anything. People are scared to propose anything because it's too. So this is where the sort of temporary comes in, or less informal architecture, something that has less jeopardy from a local authority perspective, something that's faster, and something that's interchangeable. And a lot of these temporary projects become permanent by their nature. So the second case study of something that was meant to be temporary and became permanent. And there's loads of examples of where this has happened. I mean, on a very large scale, a favela environment in Rio is informal temporary architecture, but of course it's got a permanence. People live there. Another example is Christiania, Christianshavn in Copenhagen, this kind of bricolage temporary architecture. But again, people live there, people make their home. So where we place the definition of temporary is quite difficult. And over the past 10 years especially, I think temporary urbanism has become less of a concept, and it's become quite mainstream. Even on Oxford Street, when a site is frozen, there will be a temporary use, such as a golf driving range or something else. So it's become a common tactic by developers now, whereas it used to be something that was something more for artists. So it's becoming quite a mainstream thing, I guess.
I mean, it's obviously a tactic that is that has evolved from things like the kind of grand exhibitions and festival installations. Obviously, the value is not in the installation itself per se. In some time, it is about what it done to the culture, to the debate, to the kind of people and their behavior, and then suddenly like the ability to kind of enjoy the seasons or whatever. And that's what I'm looking at. Like, suddenly there's this amazing argument about how much more funding we should have put on this building that is being in the background almost because we can't touch because of regulations or whatever. Very interesting. Now, I've got a couple of questions coming through. So one of the first questions that I'd like to ask always is, so Kirsty is asking, what happens to these temporary buildings after they use? Is there a particular approach for the afterlife of these spaces? For example, recycling and reuse of the materials, or charging the intended use for the space?
Yes, so that was a key component of the brief for the two sort of temporary installations that I spoke out for Clerkenwell Design Week, both of which the panels that we made were then taken to local schools and became resources for design technology artwork classes. So they were able to either use those, I'm not sure exactly how they did it within the school, or to modify them. So there was a sort of a circular economy debate. But the other aspect is and you see this with Elon Musk with SpaceX, how he's able to reuse rockets. So the idea of reusing installations is where you then almost sort of transcend into a kind of fully mechanical solution. So that's another question: is where do these installations go? Are they rebuilt? How can they be cannibalized into other things? But that has always been, that was always part of the brief. They were never sort of chucked in the skip, as it were.
And I've got one more time, probably just for one more question, 2 minutes before the next presentation. What do you think are the essential elements that gives the temporary project its permanence or impact?
Oh, that's a big question.
If you like.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it has to question the status quo. If it's challenging people and it's engaging, then I think that gives it longevity. When it tends to be a bit safer, that's when it's sort of forgotten and it becomes part of the everyday norm. So I think the key component has to be engaging, and it also has to be built in a way that it can be maintained, replaced, or repaired. So alongside this is this idea of kind of modularization, temporariness, the fact that you can disassemble and reassemble. I think that's very important. And there's lots of great protagonists of this, such as the French collaborative EXYZT. They did a lot of great projects. In Southwark, they did this amazing Lido a few years ago, which was, again, it was a site next to a railway that was frozen in time, and they temporarily over the summer turned it into this amazing kind of swimming pool. So that completely made you think of that site in a different way. Who would ever thought you could have a Lido next to this train line? So I think that for me epitomizes the value of sort of temporary urbanism. And I suppose the key components of that was that it was engaging, it was experiential, and it challenged what the use should be on a site.
Thank you, Phil. I think we'll have to stop it there because it's exactly 7:30, and moving on to the next presentation. Thank you so much for your time and
thank you, Shibu.
Presentation. So moving on, we've got the second presentation, or the last presentation of the day. I'm very, very excited to introduce Harry Thorpe from Cochin. And it's almost embarrassing to kind of introduce Harry, use the text that he sent me, but because I've seen him and seen Cochin develop from its early thoughts to what it is today. Since I joined, and it's not long time back, just 2015 when I arrived, I started hearing about Cochin. Harry is the founding director of Cochin, and in his role lies in the area of stakeholder engagement, wider research, and the bigger picture thinking of this really exciting practice. His role is critical in ensuring that everything Cochin project has the highest level of impact possible, and that with every stakeholder voice is heard. Through open communication with the clients and the active engagement strategy with the community end users, design techniques and workshop methodologies are always part of his careful consideration. He's always thinking ahead to possible systemic issues and challenges that could be solved through the design thinking and in design research and analysis. So over to Harry to present the presentation on creating impact through architecture. Take it away.
Yeah. Thank you, Shibu. And yeah, as you say, a bit of an interesting one, having known each other from first-year students. It seems like quite a grand introduction for what we do. I'll just share my screen. Is that coming up now? And if I cycle through a couple of slides, is that changing?
Yeah, it is.
Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, hi. My name is Harry Thorpe, as Shibu said, and I'm one of the founding directors at Cochin Studio. So for those of you that may or may not know, Cochin Studio is an architectural design and build social enterprise that creates impact through architecture. So using design and build projects as a vehicle to create social, environmental, and economic impact. This is us here with our sort of extended team once a year, which is actually about to happen in around 6 days' time. We go overseas, we go all around the world, and our team of 5 here in the UK balloons out to about 15 to 20 leaders, taking on past participants and friends and students of architecture or graduates of architecture to come and help us lead the various projects that we're undertaking in the various countries that we find ourselves that year. Corkin itself is founded on 3 core beliefs, and those are that every human being should have the opportunities and tools to shape the spaces that they inhabit. This, we believe, sort of goes without saying. Sort of imagine going into spaces that you use every day and having absolutely no say or no influence in how they work, how they look, or how they feel. The second point is that we believe all should benefit from the quality of life that's achieved through informed design. So loads of the speakers today have touched on this and have delved into loads of different areas of this. And it's been really great to hear how they've kind of resolved or collaboratively focused and attacked some of these challenges. But we think it's just that feeling of going into a space that is inspiring or feels amazing, or one that just works for you and for whoever is using it. So this point kind of stresses that why shouldn't everyone get to feel like this? And finally, construction has to reduce its environmental impact on our planet. Phil mentioned this previously, and some of the other speakers today have kind of touched on the climate crisis that we're facing. So I won't go into sort of too much detail on that. I'm sure there's much more learned people that could lecture on that one. So the way that we do this is through kind of 3 key strands in terms of our international builds. That's learn through collaboration, design through collaboration, learn through building, and experience through immersion. So design through collaboration, this involves all of our various stakeholders, which we'll get into in more detail shortly, and basically creating an open and safe environment for anyone of all ages, educational backgrounds, cultural background, to be able to come and share their specialist knowledge, which again, we've had loads of discussion today already about who and what is specialist knowledge and who brings it to the table, and how we as architects sort of sit within that ecosystem and the agency that we have to kind of pull all of those pieces of experience and expertise to create a successful project. The second is learn through building. So this pretty much is, as it says on the tin, we encourage students, local workers, and young practitioners, as it says here, to be active co-creators in a vibrant learning community. So that means getting anyone and everyone who has a passion and interest and enthusiasm on site safely, having carried out sort of tool inductions and learned all about the various elements of site safety required, and getting them on the tools to understand how a drawing, as you see on the left-hand side, turns into a building in the process in the central photo there, and all of the various different things you can learn through that process, as well as the kind of joy and the satisfaction that you get from that end result as well. Finally is experience through immersion, and this kind of for us is one of the most important factors of the 3, if any does take precedent. And we really firmly believe that there's absolutely no substitute for truly understanding a place or a user's needs than to go there, to use the space, to feel what does and doesn't work, to listen to the people, to get their input, and for them to collaboratively give us their take on what should or shouldn't be built. By living and working together, we can kind of create that safe environment that talked about earlier. And this obviously has a massive impact on the ongoing use and the maintenance for the rest of the building's lifespan. So to go back to the start, again, linking in a bit of a theme to the second set of speakers, we also met at Cardiff University, and in our second year of studying our undergraduate degree in 2015, we decided that we wanted to embark on something a little bit different and sort of challenge ourselves and the somewhat limited skills and experience that we had at that stage, and try and find some sort of project to both selfishly get to travel around the world and avoid working in a stuffy office all summer, but also to try and see in real life all the things that we've been taught, from our tech to our history lectures to everything in between, how that actually looks in real life, and all of the other stuff that maybe at this stage you haven't learned fully about, like the logistics of a project, things like bills of quantities and managing relationships with all the different stakeholders. So in 2015, we struck upon, having emailed hundreds and hundreds of NGOs and charities and all sorts of other companies, we struck upon a charity in Cambodia, on the island of Korong. So the group were working in schools in the local area on the island, teaching the children English. But they said that during the, especially during the touristy seasons, the kids were being really negatively impacted by all of the kind of knock-on effects of tourism. So things like drug and alcohol, late nights, loud music, things like that. Kids had nowhere to kind of go and either learn or play, or even learn through play outside of school time. So having spoken with Friends of Korong, the charity, having gotten feedback from the kids themselves, from the teachers, it kind of came to fruition that obviously the kids would like a playground, but also some space and capacity for work under a sheltered covered space, sort of worked and integrated in there was basically the brief for the project. We happened upon, for this project, quite a strange method of funding, and it was through the music artist Caribou, who had recently released a new single, and in that single, this giant sculptural fish was chasing the kind of main protagonist of the video. He wanted to use the fish and for it to have another life, hopefully something quite inspiring. And having told him what we were doing, he loved the idea, and actually flew the fish out to the project. And through doing so, he raised loads of awareness about the project, put it out on all of his sort of social media, and it was probably the first time we really understood sort of influencer marketing. We knew though that this wasn't sustainable, international music artists and funding from friends and family. So this kind of led to us developing a much more stakeholder-driven business model. So these are the 6 stakeholders that we consider within any and all of our projects, regardless of the scale, the permanence, the location, or the budget. These are the people that we think make the project work. Sometimes several are the same person, but they always have these different and distinctive hats within any project. So the first two, the local community and the NGO partner. The local community obviously goes without saying are incredibly important on any project. They bring the ownership, hopefully, if the project is done the right way, and they kind of bring buy-in, and they commit their time, effort, sweat, all those kinds of things to the project in return for, in inverted commas, sort of skin in the game and that ownership and love for the project itself. They also essentially give you the information, the research, the knowledge as to how to best design for their needs. The second, the NGO and charity partner, are incredibly crucial when it comes to trust and immersion. So those two that were mentioned kind of earlier on in the talk, and getting that trust of the local community themselves. The NGO partners that we work with are often based in the country themselves, or if they're not, they have been in the past for several years and have managed to integrate their working mechanisms, and often the staff that work with and for them in the country are of the communities we're working in as well. They help us to be that connection, as I say, but also they help with things more practically like logistics, local understanding, funding, and other areas of kind of maybe planning applications and the logistics sides of the project. The next are the international participants or just participants, depending on where the project is coming from. And these people are often graduates or current students of universities of architecture or engineering or all sorts of different courses. Coming from around the world quite often, this stakeholder brings a huge amount of social agency, although they may not have and aren't imposing necessarily their knowledge professionally, although some do have vast amounts. Some come as first-year students and come purely to kind of gain that experience, but unconsciously are giving that kind of social agency to the project, bringing people on site, creating a buzz, creating an excitement around the build, and learning, whilst also giving ideas towards the eventual final build. In tandem with that, and often working together throughout the weeks of the project, are our local skilled workers. So these are often really kind of important and upstanding members of the community. So people that have a lot of authority or a lot of respect within the community or within the village that we're working in. And again, really focal points in terms of galvanizing the other community members to come and work. They're often, if not always, professional tradespeople that have had years, decades of experience and help to teach both the participants, but also upskill local workers to hopefully help increase their kind of employability and working opportunities in the future. Next is the sponsor and donors kind of stakeholder. And again, this is fairly straightforward. Often we receive financial donations, or we might receive donations of materials. Here is the concrete being sort of extracted and then or poured, and then the raw materials extracted for our foundation posts for the 90 Hall in Fiji. So coming from companies all around the world, this one specifically was donated by an Australian company, so fairly nearby and with connections to Fiji directly. The other way we might receive some sort of sponsorship or donation is through pro bono advice. So time from built industry professionals, giving a huge amount of value to projects that otherwise wouldn't have had the view and the professional advice of, say, a structural engineer for cyclone resistant buildings in Fiji, or passive design specialists for moisture and humidity reduction systems in places like Vanuatu. So they transform the structures and projects to hopefully have a far greater impact and to hopefully create some sort of ripple effect in terms of implementing low-tech methods for these various areas of built experience. And then finally, we have us. So without saying too much, because I'm sure a lot of the rest of the talk will make this pretty clear, we generally consider ourselves as this sort of central point between this kind of, as I say, ecosystem of stakeholders. So making sure everyone benefits and gives value to the project equally, but similarly that everyone is heard and that their voice is valued throughout the whole process of any project. So just to go through these relatively quickly, any project that we select has to meet the kind of 4 core requirements. So that's that they are requested and approved by community leaders, that we aren't sort of going in and trying to impose something, or even someone else, be that an NGO or a company or a charity, are trying to impose something. There has to be local approval from the community leaders themselves. That sort of ties hand in hand with the community members being fully involved during the whole process. So allowing us to create those bonds and that social agency, as well as making sure that there's people, whether it's the whole community or whether it's a few at a time that then disseminate the information afterwards, but there's community representation throughout the brief formulation, the design itself, and iterating and feeding back on that. And then finally, as you see in most of the photos, throughout the construction process as well, which they're always incredibly happy to get involved in. Third is that we're best positioned to actually offer a solution that adds value and impact to the needs of the community. So being sensitive when taking on projects, making sure that we are, say, best positioned. Often we've had projects come in where the solution isn't necessarily something built, or we feel it isn't something built, and there'd be the charity or NGO would be better off spending their money elsewhere. Or it might be that they already have a team on site that could build something of a really great standard, and we provide a really small amount of design advice. Or maybe it's that the budget would be better utilized getting a different type of built professional in to help deliver the project. And we feel that that's really imperative, that we're able to know when to stand back and when they're not needed within a project. And finally, sort of linking to the first 2 again, is the skill exchange opportunities have been identified for both an international team or a team of participants, but also to kind of upskill the local community members and create those employment opportunities in the future. So objectives, so having a community-wide social impact. This classroom here is part of the library project that we completed in Vanuatu in 2019. And this is used outside of school times for local women's groups, for meetings and village craft groups to create income and sort of independent economy in that way as well. So yeah, making sure a project goes beyond just a single user group or goes beyond sort of private use. Secondly is long-term economic impact. So this kind of comes in two strands, making sure that the building isn't an economic drain on the community. So making sure that upkeep and maintenance of these projects is something discussed really early on in the brief formulation, and moving towards passive strategies or understanding the energy or general usage of the building, and therefore designing to those needs. But also on the other side, if there's a possibility for revenue generating activities. So this is our Bulabatiki VCO, so virgin coconut oil processing plants, which we'll talk a bit more about later, but a possibility for people to create income from the actual building itself, as well as potentially, as I said a few times, upskilling themselves to be more employable from the project itself. And finally, low or positive environmental impact. So sustainability and responsible materials used, lowering the carbon footprint, hopefully, and avoiding carbon heavy materials where possible. And again, using passive or low tech design strategies like natural ventilation, thinking about the siting and orientation of the building, some pretty basic things that I'm sure you've all gone throughout architecture school as well. So looking at the way that we kind of started to increase in scale and complexity in 2017, we stepped up the scale of our projects, working on a full-scale kindergarten and community hall in Fiji, having established these key stakeholders and also recognized the need for these projects. Looking at how to run those projects successfully and smoothly, we, as I say, found those right people, the local skilled tradespeople. Here we've got Simi and Tim, who were our local carpenters, who helped us with loads of local methodologies that we then cross-referenced with the kind of structural expertise that we'd found, and found some pretty nice kind of composite detailing that kind of satisfied both the local vernacular or the local methodology, but also had been filtered and challenged by professional structural engineers. In terms of the projects themselves, there are a whole plethora of design considerations, but generally these are the kind of 7 or so that we kind of focus down on the most. I'll try and get through these fairly quickly, but generally looking at budget, so working with charities and NGOs, they have a very strict red line budget that we can't go beyond. So using local materials like strip bamboo to clad buildings in a way that is maintainable for the local community. So all created by them and ideas that they've come up with, but saves a load of money on materials for the charity and their budgets. The climate, so desktop surveys before we get out, and doing as much research as we can from where we are. Also getting local community members to hopefully carry out pretty low tech and basic kind of surveys of the site themselves, and using kind of pro bono stakeholders to bring value from their experience to the build that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So things like climatic issues like hurricanes and flooding and things like this. Materials, so again, being as locally sustainable as we can, but also using materials that are local to allow for replication of those builds, of those details. So we've seen many a portal frame now across some of the villages in Fiji, where people have built their own houses using pretty similar methods as to how we built the original kindergartens or village halls nearby. Skill level. So most of the people that come out with us as participants have a fairly low skill level. And as I said earlier, we have a lot of local workers that are looking to be upskilled. So using construction methodologies that are repetitive and therefore instill and help to very quickly improve people's use of tools and abilities to understand quite, I guess, rudimentary structural ideas. So things like portal frames and truss building allows us to kind of get to grips pretty quickly, even with a lower skill level. Time, we have a really finite amount of time, often due to availability of materials, budget, the weather patterns, all sorts of things. So on site, as you can see here, several things often have to happen at once. So we might have foundations being dug at one end whilst portal frames are being assembled at another side of site, and suddenly 3 weeks into the build, we look like we've got an entire building that was previously just holes in the ground and timber on the floor. Information is another consideration that we have to think about. So we can't always visit the site multiple times beforehand. We often get to sites the year before. On our current build, we'll look at the build for the next year and analyze that site as close as we can. But a lot of things are out of our hands, as I say, with the tight budgets and with a mind to sustainability and climate issues. We're obviously not flying out to Fiji once a month to check in on the site. So being able to design in a way that is flexible and design sort of 75 to 80% of the building and designing it in a way that it can be shifted or moved or being able to basically adapt and be flexible once we get to site. Sometimes we might get to a new project and someone who's gone out to take photos for us has taken 270 degrees around the site, and behind them there's a massive drop off or a ravine, and we have to suddenly kind of reconsider. We're really, really lucky that our pro bono engineers and other specialists are always on hand to help us solve any problems really quickly when we get out there. And finally, often one of the biggest considerations is access to sites. So when we're sat at university, we're often thinking about our designs or can sometimes be pulled into thinking of our designs in a vacuum and not thinking about how those materials are actually getting onto site. And this is quite a stark contrast once you get out on some of these projects and you see the kind of methods by which materials get to site. So here we've got a giant container ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, dropping bags of cement, sand, and gravel off onto small fishing boats to get all of our materials for the coconut oil processing plants over through a tiny coral reef, break in the coral reef rather, straight onto the beach, where there are no roads and no way of getting materials from one end of the island to the other. So starting to think about how much load can that boat take, how much cost is it, how much petrol is it, how can we design around that, what lengths of timber can we get on the smaller ships. It all starts to feed into the designs themselves, as well as the construction methodologies that we choose to build with. So a few of our builds, this is the Ramwest School in Vanuatu, tackling really high relative humidity, books being sort of disintegrated very quickly due to the humidity levels. So using methods of passive ventilation, heating up the space to sort of lower the humidity or raise the temperature to wick away the moisture, and separating the books using sort of split bamboo there. You can see all the books separated out to increase that kind of surface area to allow the air to ventilate through and as I say, wick off that moisture. We've had some reports back since 2019 that there's been around a 20% reduction in humidity compared to the original and the main classroom space. So we're really happy with some of the results there. And as well as that, the school itself actually was hit by a Category 5 cyclone, causing widespread destruction across the island. And this was one of only 3 buildings in the village that remained in working condition. So showing that really important addition of using both structural engineers and passive design specialists, really creating a massive impact for this local community. Our Evergreen School in Zambia. So this project was all about trying to, with the charity Mothers of Africa, who are looking at trying to reduce infant mortality and really improve maternal health in some quite specific areas, and in this case Zambia, keeping girls in higher education for longer. We really wanted to make a point and really try to exercise our agency by employing as many women as possible on site and getting as many of the younger girls on the project to help build the eventual school that they would be working in. The school itself helps to reduce the class sizes from sometimes in excess of 80 kids, down to much more manageable sizes of sort of 30 to 40 kids in a class. And we've had really good reports back of the kind of internal qualities and the cool temperatures that they're now able to experience whilst learning, massively increasing the kind of concentration levels and hopefully the quality of education that the kids are receiving.
All right.
Yeah.
We have run out of time. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I thought we might do. That's okay.
Because it's almost like 8 o'clock. I don't want to kind of not have a chance to discuss your work.
No problem.
I know you probably have a lot more projects to show, and it's really, really exciting. But I think there's a couple of interesting questions that comes through. And if I do have any one more question that I've got 3 or 4 questions already, but if there's anyone else who want to ask any question, please do type in the Q&A button on the Zoom window. Now, there's a question from Meena asking about the community projects itself, and I'm going to combine my question along with her question here just to save some time. She's asking, what are the kind of features or elements of a successful community project? And I was, while you was explaining the project and how you kind of identify the program and what need to be done for the community, etc. I'm thinking about, like, when do you start engaging? When do you start the actual construction program? How long does it take for the project to create a program that makes sense to you technically and as a social entrepreneur, but also is something that convinces the community that this is what is going to change the quality of life of that village or community?
How long does it take? I mean, I guess it really is
just give us an example of like one project or something, just to kind of understand how long did it take for anybody who's thinking of doing similar projects.
Okay. So to frame it that way, we generally, our projects will be at their shortest, can be put together and on site from that first conversation to finished within 8 to 10 months, and some of the longer ones can take up to 2 or 3 years. Obviously, it really depends on the community members, how sort of enthusiastic and ambitious they are, but also how well they can communicate amongst themselves, and communicate with the NGO and then relay that back to us. If they're really ambitious and really enthusiastic about what they want to do, and we can hold things online and remotely, then that can happen really quickly. So we've managed to put projects together in 6 to 8 months, and they've been, in terms of a measure of success, we go back there every year to Fiji, and they're packed full of people and they're being used every day, and a community hall turns into a primary school or whatever they need it to be. And for us, that's kind of the measure of success, as you turn up to the buildings and they're full.
I don't think Meena meant like the measure of success from that perspective. It is looking at, if you have to write this up as a set of key principles that made the project successful, what would that?
Okay. Well, then I guess so. Yeah, I guess the things that I said in that answer were enthusiasm and ambition from the local community, open and honest conversation, which also has to be clear communication. So whether that's done remotely or whether that's done in person, that all comes from trust. So there has to be trust between the local community, the NGO, and us, that everyone has each other's interests at heart, and that people feel comfortable to come forward with their expertise, because it might be you get to a middle of the project and someone's then telling you how they thought we should have done it in the first place. And that's because there wasn't trust at the very start for them to have brought that forward, or there wasn't clear enough communication for them to have brought that forward. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to put it into a few words, I guess trust, enthusiasm, and ambition, I suppose.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I would stop it there because I do need to thank all of you guys who have done a fantastic presentation in the whole of this, the 3-hour session that we had since 4 o'clock today, or 4-hour session. Many of them have already gone off, but I'd like to officially thank all of you who presented, and particularly in this session, Harry and Phil, who's still here, and has been really, really interesting in terms of the conversations that we had, the discussions that we're having about your work and its value, its impact, and how it kind of shaped or transformed the community and improved quality of life. The last thing that I would like to say is about or to invite everybody who's here in the panel as well as in the audience about the 24th of June, which is the opening of our exhibition, which starts at 6 o'clock. So you're all welcome to come to view it on that day, and it'll be fantastic if we can register on the Eventbrite link that you might have received, so that we know who's coming. 6 o'clock it starts with the music, and then it goes on. And 7 o'clock we have the opening address by the head of school, Professor Juliet Davis, followed by the keynote speech from Rajiv Katpalia, who is the partner at the B.B. Doshi's office. B.B. Doshi, as some of you may know, has been the gold medalist for RIBA gold medalist this year, and was the 2018 Pritzker Prize winner. So it's really, really exciting to invite him to the show. He's going to speak online, but he's been a friend, a mentor, and a real guide for me in building my career in architecture and architectural education. And then we'll finish with a little presentation about designing and building the exhibition itself, followed by some awards and prizes. There's music throughout the evening, which is presented by our own little band that we formed a few days back, or a few weeks back, and they'll be doing their first performance during the night. It'll be a super exciting evening full of interesting conversation, music, and talks. Looking forward to seeing you all during that event, and have a good evening.